University of Delaware. Okay. So.
Jim's on the ball there. Let me see if I can do it this
way. So last class we went over a few things, and then this time we're going to go over the next steps. We're going to go over kind of writing it up. How do you actually write up? How do you code? Number one, how do you analyze your data? But also then how do you write it up? And again, with the 2 hours I have, we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty, the real details. What I have done is I provided with 3 papers that I've written. One is with Heather, and a few others that are more in the kind of, they've been written in more health-oriented journals. There's others I can share with you if you want some more examples. But these were three good examples of how to write up your methods and your analysis, and they're distinct in that way. So in one sense, there's one where I'm using, I think where the flow piece, we use kind of a frequency kind of analysis of particular types. Another is more of a here's a theme, here's examples from the data kind of thing. And I'll go over those a little bit later when we get into that element of our discussion. Were there any questions? I had asked Heather to kind of reach out to you guys to see if there's any particular questions. No one had any, but is there any now? When we get here today, specific things that you'd like for me to cover today? No? All right, some of this will be fairly new. I know not a lot of you have been, how many of you have been starting to code your data, analyze your data? No? Okay, no problem. So this will kind of be in the future. So there's going to be a few details that I will glance over because they're very specific, and I don't want to overwhelm you. But they're on the slides. You get the slides, and I'm always available as a resource to anyone. So you can always come back to me and say, hey, you had said this, could you explain a little bit more? And then later today, I'm going to email Heather a list of references that I use on a daily basis for my qualitative work, books, certain flyers, so that you all have them so you can turn. I'll also be referencing a lot of them today. Okay? So, let's see. Today, which is good. Okay, so last session we did an overview of different types of qualitative methods, interviews, observations, PAR, that kind of stuff. We talked about some benefits to each one, some hurdles to each one, certain data gathering tips and tools, and we highlighted potential, like I said, benefits and pitfalls of certain methods. This session we're going to go over kind of what happens after you gathered your data, how do you analyze it or code it, and then how do you write up those methods and your analysis in a way that is that's good enough for publication, but also good enough for reports that people can understand them. All right, and we'll go over how to do coding. One of the things that I want to make sure you understand, though, this is something I have to constantly tell my graduate students, there is not one correct way to analyze your data. All right, so we're going to go over particular steps that are highlighted in resources that I use, that you get some names for coding procedures. But this takes a little bit of, like I said in the last class, qualitative methods take a little bit of a feel, kind of a touch, a sensitivity, if you will, a vulnerability to the data. Just like when you're gathering the data, there's a vulnerability that you need to have, a sensitivity to it, especially with coding, because you are the interpretive tool. Right? There's not a specific statistical analysis test that you can use to say, hey, I have this kind of data, so I'm going to use this kind of test, and I'm going to have this outcome, and that's how I interpret this. That's not how it goes in qualitative data. You are the filter. You are the individual that's going through it, and your team, perhaps if you have other coders, you're the ones going through it and interpreting that reality that's been constructed. Okay? And that's sometimes hard to wrap your head around, right? You've gone in, you have observed, or you've gathered information at a particular point in time, and others have presented their reality to you. You then have to go and interpret that reality to then say, hey, and then say, here's what's happening. That's kind of tough. So we'll go over some ways of doing that in a valid way. So when we talk about analysis, we're talking about coding, right? We're coding the data, and we'll talk about what that means. What is coding? It organizes, manages, it compares, and it retrieves particular data elements. Codes are labels that assign symbolic meaning to the descriptive or inferential information compiled during a study. Codes are attached to data chunks. So we sometimes go through and we look through our data and we say, oh, this is a big, long, 3-sentence thing. This has to do with this particular concept, right? Chunks of data. We talk about it as essence capturing, a critical link between data collection and interpretation or explanation. And this is, I think, the number one thing we have to talk about today, researcher-generated concept. Right now, we'll talk about inductive and deductive codes today, things that you get from previous literature, previous research that's been written about this subject, so kind of these deductive codes. But then there's also these inductive codes, things that you think that are coming from the data themselves that you are seeing. Right? We'll talk about what those mean. And one of the main reasons that we use coding is to kind of condense all of that data into digestible parts, into kind of related linkages. And here we go, talking about those linkages right here. Nice thing, right? You want to be able to build relationships, uncover themes, kind of you want to identify the linkages in the data, right? So you are going out there and you're seeing these things. Well, what are they talking about, and then how does that relate to this particular phenomenon, right? You're trying to develop those relationships. Data reduction or simplification, in a way, analysis is deconstructing the data to then reconstruct it in your interpretation. Kind of breaking it down to then build it back up into what you think is happening or your team think is happening. And if you're engaging in participatory action research, you're incorporating those involved in the research to help you understand, to engage in that reconstruction. So the key to coding is your use of reflection. All right, again, you are the analysis tool in this particular qualitative methods. So your understanding of the situation of the phenomenon that you are studying is really key. And you have to reflect on that. And we talked about this in a number of ways, right? Understanding your status as a researcher, understanding your status as kind of your race, class, gender, all of these things that you kind of bring to the table when you're gathering the data, how might those then impact your analysis and interpretation of that data as well? So another reason to have a number of other coders that may be seeing what you're seeing, but also engaging with the audience and the participants that you're engaging in. Coding is never a mechanistic activity. Codes are not static. Do you guys understand what I mean there? Right? They move. They're not just like, this stays here. This is exactly what it is. And it's not okay, this means this happens here. It evolves. It changes. It's very sensitive. As you get through maybe one or two transcripts of your focus group data or your interview data or your observation notes, right, you might say, wait, I thought it was this. But now it's starting to look like this. And that's okay. That's a good thing. And maybe you're reading more of the literature and you're saying, okay, wait, actually I want to refine it even more so into this level. That's exactly what should be happening. It shouldn't just be, okay, this is exactly what's happening right when you read one interview. And maybe for some, hey, that actually happens, that's huge. But more than likely it's going to get refined and refined and refined as you continue to gather data and read about the data and then actually interpret the data. I leave this on here. I've used this slide a few times when I teach the class, and I still cannot remember why I put this picture in.
It's so great, though.
I know, it's like, it's too cool to take away. I'm like, wait, what do I mean by why is there an elephant with an earring on a rowboat?
And I can see elephant, that typical analogy of the elephant, right? I'm feeling the tail,
yeah,
you're
I do the
feeling
tail.
the tusk.
But then I've used that before. Yeah, I've
but
used
why
it.
an earring on a rowboat? That I can't.
So I use that, and this is what I mean to say, but I'm like, why did I now? What's the connection there? What's the link?
One day,
Yeah.
one
Someone's
day
got to code this, right? So multi-step stage process is not just something that you're going to do one time and then that's done. You're going to go over and over and over again. A lot of times what will happen is initial coding or initial coding will be just reading through your transcripts. Right, just reading through your transcripts as they're happening, or when you're all done, we can discuss that, which is a better way of doing things. It usually depends on your research questions. But you can read through your transcripts and you can start to see things in the data. You can start to see kind of categories that keep on, or concepts that keep on popping up. So you jot them down, you start to see things, right? But you keep on going through that. Then you go back and you start using a pen and a paper, or you plug it into NVivo, right? And you start to code really hard, secondary coding, right? Now, how many of you are planning on using like NVivo or MaxQDA or something like that?
We're going to use
What are they?
The Deuce, okay, I've never used that one.
What are they?
Oh, sorry, they're computer software for coding qualitative data.
Do we have access?
For Excel?
They should. That would be brilliant. They should.
Yeah, I don't
They should
think
provide it.
so,
I-
but I
Are they
would
providing
guess-
Stata or SPSS for others?
We have SPSS, I know at Nemours.
They should.
Yeah, I'm sure Nemours has a qualitative software.
Agreement.
Yeah, I would think, we can ask.
Even
them.
I don't even think the University of Delaware does. I'll have to check on that. Because if we didn't, I'd be surprised.
Different departments have site licenses.
Oh, do they? Okay, good. Because I know we have SPSS, but it's like, well, I don't use it. I don't use that often, you know.
We had trouble at UD. We were using in vivo.
Yeah.
And it could only be used in certain places,
Yes.
at least in
Yes.
terms of our department.
Yeah.
And we got into coding, data analysis, and then all of a sudden we weren't able to get the full.
Was it different years of the
Exactly.
program? Yeah. Because you can't. I remember when 9 and 10, I was teaching in class, and some computers I think it was a library somewhere on campus, had 9, and some had 10, and so I was trying to teach 2 different versions of it. So it's a huge problem. But anyway, so it's the software. It can be very useful, and people have their own favorites. I used to love MaxQDA back in the day. Now I use NVivo because it's more available on campus.
I learned on Atlas TI.
Yes, and I have grad students that love Atlas TI. So,
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think it's because what you kind of grow up on, to some extent, like
Right.
same with like data, SAS or SPSS or those kind of things. It's kind of what you feel comfortable with. I'm not going to go over those softwares today. The way I'm going to be referring to coding is kind of the old school method. I do it by hand. I still don't use a lot of, I only use statistical software, like an NVivo or something like that to do a primary code if I have more than 100. If I have less than 100 interviews or observation notes or focus groups, I do them all by hand.
Does the software pull out key phrases? Is that
Exactly.
what we're talking
And then
about?
I pop it, and then I print them all out,
Mhm.
and then I code those key phrases
Okay.
throughout.
So it gets key phrases, but is there any way for the software?
Oh, it can do
obviously
everything.
not to pick up themes or anything?
It can. Oh, it can.
Oh,
It
wow.
actually can.
Wow.
You can. It's so like I'm going to speak to NVivo specifically, and I know others could probably do this as well. They're so advanced in which you can find the linkages. There's like an actual not equation, but something a process you can use within the software that allows you to say, okay, when this and these kind of codes come up together, show me where that happens in this data, and it can show you, and then you can pull that all out. I mean, and I'm sure there's other ones that do all this stuff too as well. It's very interesting. You can use it to code not just interview or like the written word. You can do that for sure, but it can also do pictures and videos. Yeah, so and audio files too. So it can do a lot. Like, these software packages can do a lot, and they're very useful. Again, I talk a lot about feel and sensitivity and vulnerability. So if I don't have it in my hand, I can't feel. I can't feel it. I feel like I'm getting distant from my data, and I don't want to do that. That's just me personally. Everyone uses NVivo. You'll even see there. I've used NVivo in some of those studies. So it is useful. It definitely is. I prefer. I like to write all over it, make my connections, like to memo in the sides, that kind of stuff. So anyway, it's a multi-code software. So heuristic process, the method of discovery, it's intimate, it's very interpretive, right? You are the interpreter. Miles Huberman and Saldana are the people I'm going to be referencing a ton here, especially Saldana, who has written a few books on coding. I will post all of these references to Heather, and she will send them all to you. They're particular books that you can get at any library. I also have them. If you need a copy, you're welcome to use it. The way we'll be talking about it is kind of the more fundamental elements of coding. First cycle and second cycle. First cycle, you're working with the big bulks. You're getting those big major codes, primary codes, right? These big things that encapsulate a lot of stuff. Your second is more refined, right? You're working with the results of those primary ones, and you're kind of, the way I like to describe it is this, like your primary way, you're breaking the rocks. Like you're breaking down those chunks. And then in the secondary, you're really getting there, polishing stuff with a toothbrush, basically, right? You're really cleaning it up. Those are the two main ways of, like, the easiest ways of looking at things. Now, there's a number of other stages you can use. You can do, primary could take you 3 to 5 different stages or more. And then secondary could take even more, right? Depending upon how much data you have, what you're finding. But the easiest way to break it down is into these 2 major cycles. I'm going to go through, and I'm going to show you how it can be broken down into all these different first stage and second stage. But what I'm about to show you is something I'm going to gloss over. because what I want to show you how Miles Uberman and Saldana talk about the details, the specificity, if you will, of first cycle coding. But we're not going to go into the details because we would sit here forever. So I'm just going to show you, and then we're going to talk about it. So this is why I'm saying, like, you'd be drowning in this. So I just want to go through it. So this is what Miles Uberman and Saldana, specifically Saldana, talk about in terms of first cycle coding. They have different types of it. The first type is elemental. And of the elemental first cycle coding, there are these kind of types of coding, or types of codes. Descriptive coding, right? Some of you may remember I talked about descriptive kind of methods, or descriptive, like we talked about, we describe the whole scenario, what's happening. It's not really data gathering, but it is, that kind of thing. Good for environments and settings. And then there's in vivo, there's process, right? I'm just gonna glance over. I'll go back with any questions, but I just want to show you. Then there's affective. So there was elemental, and now there's affective. Now we're talking about emotions, values, evaluation, right? Still in first cycle, these guys are talking about literary language, talking about dramaturgical coding. So what I'm trying to show you is there's all these types of codes and these ways of coding in first cycle, and this is how the main people are writing about it. It can get look, we're still in it, right? Exploratory type. You can have holistic, provisional, hypothesis. It gets overwhelming. Procedural, protocol, causation coding, grammatical, attribute, and magnitude fall under grammatical. And then Miles Uberman and Saldana talk about subcoding within the first cycle. That's one kind of way I really disagree. What I want kind of to talk about today is let me just pull back here. Don't worry so much about all these types of coding. This is why I was hoping you had a little bit of data. Don't worry so much about it, because you can always go back to your references and you can see what these things look like. What I suggest is that you just code. Just get in it. I'll put it this way, I read up here, I haven't seen that many, except for that many articles, except for those appearing specifically in explicit qualitative methods journals that go into, I used protocol coding and then causation coding. I've just heard, I've heard primary coding, secondary coding, that kind of code, right? So I also don't use that language myself. Now, in vivo coding, I have heard. Descriptive coding, sure. So some of these you'll see occasionally, but a healthy majority of those articles coming out that use qualitative methods when they're talking about their analysis, they talk about coding, general primary coding. Here are some subcodes I used in my secondary coding process, in the next stage of secondary coding process, right? So we don't use these terms all the time, all right? So I wanted to show them to you so you understood how specific it really can be. And you can get specific, but it can get overwhelming if you're not doing this all the time. This is not your major thing, and if you're not like a major qualitative researcher, this can get pretty hard. But at the same time, to remember all these things I should say, at the same time, you may want to look through these and say, hey, you know what, when I begin analysis, I want to start by doing provisional coding. Then I'll move to dramaturgical or something like that, or if you're really specifically, if your research question is specific about emotions, you may want to say, I'm going to go affective coding, look at emotion coding, values coding, maybe evaluation. And you can do that, for sure. But if you are doing exploratory analysis, going into an area that a lot of people haven't done yet, or you don't really know what you're going to find yet, I strongly suggest you just open code. All right? And what I mean, you guys probably heard that term before, open code. What I mean is you engage in a more kind of inductive process. You let the data speak to you, right? You can read all you want and have those ideas of what you may find in your head, which is completely fine, right? And you may even use those as deductive codes. And you're going to want to write those down. I'll talk those about in a little bit. But allow the data to speak to you in a way that it says it can tell its story. Right? If you go in there like, I'm going to look specifically at emotions, you got blinders on, you might miss some major cool things that are happening in your data. Right? So this is, I find it helpful. I personally don't use it as often as I possibly should, but like I say here, I just code. I don't think like, oh, I'm process coding, even though I know these terms. I just code. What guides me specifically are my research questions and my research topic. These are the things I'm looking for, and previous data, or previous research, I should say. So if I've gone ahead and I've read a lot about my research topic, and even people have done similar things and engaged in qualitative methods, I will read theirs, and I will say, okay, well, show me how did you do your coding? How did you do your analysis? And I say, okay, well, that clearly is a valid way of doing it. So maybe I'll follow suit and do a very similar way of doing it. And I'll look at the codes that they found and say, okay, well, these have been identified as important codes. Let me go ahead and map those, put those on the side so I can use those later on. But at the same time, I'm going to have my own things identified. And that's kind of what happened with flow, right? With our piece on finding workplace flow. We had, and we'll talk about linkages later, and I'll go more to that. But there was ideas about... Hello, yeah. There was ideas about what would impact research in primary care settings from previous research. And so we knew some things that we were going to look for, but we also wanted the data to speak to itself. So, yes?
So you may get to this, maybe kind of get into this later, but can you talk a little bit about coding another person?
Sure. Yeah, so now there's a number of ways.
Or
more than one person. Exactly. There's a number of ways and techniques you can go about that. So if you have a team of people coding, there's a few, my suggestion would be that you all take the same transcript and you all code it individually. And then you come together and you see what matches, what doesn't. What have you come up with? More than likely, because you've all read the same stuff. You probably were all at the same, maybe you didn't all go to the interview or the focus group, but you'll probably come up with very similar large codes. The tricky stuff that I found when you code with others that comes into is when you start getting the subcodes and developing the linkages and finding those themes. That's where it becomes a little bit more difficult. But those major overarching primary codes, you'll probably find a lot of agreement. So, and when you don't, you have a discussion. And you say, okay, show me how you found this. Show me the data that is exemplary of this particular code, right? You can do that for subcodes as well. Then I usually do that 3 times. And once there's general consensus, I say, okay, fine. You take 5, I take 5, they take 5. And then you go on and you kind of come back. And if there's any like, oh, I'm having a little problem with that, then you can read the rest. But that's the way I usually use it. Other people will give more. We'll do 3 at a time. Or they'll just sit there and go through all in one room together.
Is there any specific level of inter-rater reliability you strive for?
You can do that. Yeah, you went high, right? So you want, you can just even use a percentage to some extent. And you can count it. To me, it seemed, you put it in a paper, so it's important, but anyone can say they had high inter-rater reliability. It's just like, so I don't know how useful it is, but sometimes the reviewers want it, editors want it, so, you just count the number of times you all found the same codes, or the number of codes you all found the same. These were all held in agreement, these, out of all the primary codes, 75 and 85%, were, the higher you have, the better. Everyone agreed on these, and it's good to put in, because like I said, a lot of reviewers will want it. But at the same time, I know in ours, we've just put that there was, initial consensus, and anything that was a disagreement any disagreements were resulted in consensus or through discussion, something like that, and that's usually acceptable as well. As long as they understand that there is. And this comes to kind of the most major point about writing up your methods and your analysis process, right? And that's where those will come in handy. You have to be as specific and detailed as possible. You have to earn the right to show your interpretation. So when you're writing up your analysis of qualitative data, that's where things get iffy, right? How just because you or your team found this, how are we sure that everyone would find this? You'll notice in some of the examples that I provided, I give examples of how themes were found. So we had, first time primary code or primary stage found these codes, these large ones. From coding those large ones, we then found these subcodes. And then in reanalyzing the entire data using these subcodes, we found these connections. Using that connection as a code, we went through the entire data again. And this is what it is. This is what the theme discusses. This is the full elaboration of that theme. right? And those are usually very helpful to reviewers and to editors. They find those, okay, I can see how you might have done this now. That makes sense to me. Because without the data in front of them, not like a valid actual statistical analysis, you have to show them exactly what you did. Be as specific as you can. And that's the number one thing you can do while you're coding is keeping a step-by-step thing of what you did, of the menu. But I did this, what I did first, here's what I found. Be as detailed as possible. Do not slouch on that. It can get, I love coding, and it can get very fun. Like really quickly, you start to hit things, you're like, oh man, this is happening, right? And you start losing sight of, okay, how did I just find that? It can come real fast. You're like, how did I get there? You know yourself that you got there. You know it was right, but you don't know how to say how you got there. My grad students all the time is the hardest part. I'm like, tell me how you got to that particular theme. Where did you find this? Well, they just don't remember. So writing it down, exactly what happened in each stage is key. And that helps when you're coding with other people as well. If you first go in, you're reading your own thing and you're going to compare it later to your colleague, if you have a written tally of what you did, the steps you did, you can say, here's how I found this. Rather than, well, it says it right here. This is what, that kind of thing. So keeping detailed, explicit notes will only help you when you're working with others, but also when you're trying to get ready to publish. Okay.
We published one during my fellowship, and I just remember the reviewers, because it was more of a medical journal,
Mm-hmm.
was the Journal of the American Geriatric Society.
Probably cut it.
And they they hated it,
Yeah.
but they published it.
Yeah.
But they, I think some of these terms may have helped, because we
Yeah.
actually did hypothesis testing.
Yeah, exactly.
So now that I'm learning these terms, I'm like, oh, if I'd thrown something like that out, they probably would have been like, cool.
Yeah.
But instead I just had to get really descriptive, and they were fine with it in the end. But ooh, they were like, what is this? What are you doing?
It doesn't feel good to some. Yeah, to certain types of journals, it doesn't feel right. And again, those terms, and if you're using them properly, can be very effective, especially when you're writing, because you're actually giving a name to the process that you're doing. Hey, this is an actual thing. I can cite it, and I did it, right? Instead of like where I say, well, I engaged in a multi-step coding process. Like, well, what is that? Be more specific. So I constantly have to cite the idea of a multi-stage coding process.
Barrett?
Yes.
Yeah. I really appreciate this.
Yeah.
My whole academic career, I've been a quantitative researcher.
Okay.
And now collaborating with a qualitative researcher. And I've come to appreciate well-written qualitative journal articles. But hearing you explain how they're constructed,
Yes.
I still feel like I don't have any firm foundation to trust
Yes.
what I'm reading as representing the right story about the research question.
Exactly.
And one of the key questions I have is, when you form a research question, sometimes you're just completely exploring.
Right.
You have no preconceptions about what you think the answer will be.
Yeah.
But it's rare. I mean, when we're all really honest, we think these are the
We have
relationships, or
ideas.
these are the dynamics we'll find.
Yeah.
So, assuming that I have a preconception of what I'm going to find,
Yeah.
but it's never been documented before or whatever.
Right.
How do I prevent that from influencing the coding process, which is so, from your description, subject? I mean,
It is. No, it is.
it's not.
You're right. It is
You know,
tricky.
I don't have fences to stay within. I don't have guidelines.
I know.
And it sounds like I could unconsciously or intentionally code to get exactly what I wanted to confirm.
Exactly.
And how do the reviewers, therefore the vetting process, reviewers know if I've done a lousy job of interpreting my statistical analyses and how the results turn out. But reviewers, it seems to me, have to have a lot of trust, and you're talking about using the right terms to convince them they should trust us.
Exactly.
They should trust our coding. They're not going to go and code it themselves to see are we even in the ballpark.
Exactly.
So if they're trying to trust us, how do we trust us?
That's a great question. And really, that's a phenomenal question, because, like I've said, like my primary point is that you are the tool. You are the interpretive tool, right? You are the procedure. You are the mathematical equation, statistical equation to get the outcome, right? So how can you not be biased to some extent based upon fundamental status-based biases, and even reading previous literature? How are you not influenced by the idea of what may be happening? There's no way. I mean, it comes down to a philosophical question, right? Is there value-free research? right? Is there ever value? And no, there isn't. I mean, even in statistical analysis, I would say that there are tools that you can use or procedures you can use to get the data that you were actually looking for, right? You can use a particular test instead of another one because you found that the findings there agree a little bit more significant than the way another test, right? So with qualitative methods, the best thing you can do is be as open and as vulnerable as possible. So what you want to do is if you can do hypothesis testing in qualitative methods, right? You can say, I think based upon previous literature on this similar topic, I'm going to find X, Y, Z as primary codes or this particular theme. However, I'm going to engage in inductive coding to see if there's anything else as well. Right? So you have to be as specific as your intentions and your processes as possible to gain that trust. You have to earn the trust and then show that your interpretation is okay.
One article actually had a section that I found curious but revealing, and it said it was almost a confession of the researcher bias.
Those are the best.
And it actually said these.
Here's where I come from standpoint.
I thought, whoa, this person was honest, but it allowed me to actually evaluate it with, with more honesty.
Those are, in my opinion, the best, and that's becoming more. And I know, especially in social sciences literature, it's becoming very important to. There was a big article in the New York Times a couple of days ago about Alice Goffman, and I'm getting a little off topic, but she is the daughter of a massive Irving Goffman, who was a huge, sociologist back in the day. She didn't really know him, but anyway, it's still. There's arguments that maybe she was given a little bit more leeway because she's getting Goffman's work. Anyway, her research on low-income, low-education individuals in West Philly came into a book, and it's received huge acclaim in the sociological realms, but also a lot of concern because of the way she interpreted her data, the closeness she got to her participants, a lot of the elements that you're talking about in terms of how she interpreted things were going on. How do we know that that's actually happening? And the number one issue is that she was dealing with a lot of minorities, specifically African American individuals, and here is this high SES, high education, white female now interpreting the culture and language and interactions of an area that she is not brought up in, she has not been involved in. She argues that she got close enough, she did ethnography, that she was in it enough. She did ethnography for like 6 to 8 years. That she was close enough to it that she got close to enough to understand it. And a lot of sociologists argue you will never get it to that. You will never get it to the point of which it actually exists. You have constructed their reality from your interpretation. She has no what I'm trying to get at is that there was no standpoint disclosure in her book. And people argue that she should have at least explicitly acknowledged that standpoint from the get-go so that we can say, okay, thank you, give us your interpretation of what you think happened. We can hold this in the back of our head and say, all right, you don't get it, but you do, but you got it as far as you could get it. So those types of things are extremely helpful and allow people to see where you're coming from, the value, what you bring to the table, basically, when you're interpreting. Which includes your job, your race, your gender, your age, all of those things, as well as your background in the area. So that's a way of doing it as well. But again, I think it all comes down to earning the right to engage in interpretation, which means that you have gone through a rigorous analysis of the data. You didn't just stop at your primary codes. A lot of times people get lazy with, oh, look what I found, this big honking theme. No. Get deeper into it, get farther into it, and show how you did that. So exhaustive, rigorous methods. And what I mean by that is a constant, it's not just, coding and then using those little chunks to then code. Sometimes you do that at the very end. It's going through those transcripts over, in entirety, over and over. I have about 5 to 6 copies of clean transcripts. Of one transcript, I'll have 5 to 6 copies. I'll use one for the first day, the next one to the next one. Right? And so I go through them that way. So explicitly detailing every step you took, engaging in rigorous multi-stage coding procedures, showing descriptive details of each code and subcode so that people can see that. I actually, when I review qualitative method papers, I often ask for a coding table. So what does this code actually mean? Because you say it was huge. What are you talking about? Because the only time we usually get it is in their interpretation. I found this, and here's the theme. Here's what it means. No, I want to know that code. Question?
No,
Go ahead.
I'm, go ahead.
Oh, hi, sorry. So,
I'm thinking, and I
Yeah.
have something to say, but
Okay.
I can absolutely wait until you.
So I like to see-
Except that I can't, because I'm talking, obviously.
so I like to see those codes, and sometimes people like to see them as well in terms of frequency analysis of how often they actually appeared. I'm not a huge fan of that. Because just because it came up a lot doesn't mean it was really that important. It could have been a real minor thing that just people just talked about, but they didn't give any meat to. You know, so the more meat of something may only come up as in maybe less frequently, but it really has substance in this data. So, but that's another way of showing it. You know, hey, this came up this many times, and it came up in this many interviews from this many people, and this many times throughout all the interviews. And some people give valid to that, and that's fine. It's not my cup of tea.
Selection of the team can be really important
Yeah.
too. I know that, you know, I purposely wanted non-physicians
Yeah.
when we went and
Huge.
talked to physician practices. But I also, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think, you know, kind of like thinking in terms of the insider and the outsider. You know, because there are things that, as the outsider, there's a lingo and a culture that you might miss.
You might assume.
You know, you might
Yeah.
assume or misinterpret.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, the insider is probably going to have stronger biases, stronger
Exactly.
preconceived, you know, notions about what something means or what you're going to find. So to kind of, if you, you know, almost construct your team around this sense
Yeah.
of, if
Have a
you're-
naysayer, if you will.
yeah, and
Yeah.
if you're thinking, okay, what are the biases that I would disclose about this?
Yeah.
So, for instance, I'm a white, high SES person going into West Philly.
Mhm.
Well, then maybe I really want to involve
Yeah, exactly.
somebody who's not.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's when you involve especially this is where PAR comes into excellent resource. Because if you're studying patients of a particular procedure or something that you've never undergone, you know, then you're going to want, hey, is this actually this is what the data is telling me. Could you tell me if this is actually what you're feeling or what you're experiencing? Right? That always provides that as well. And that can be, I mean, because then you're going back to the source and you're saying, tell me that if this is true or not, and if not, where are we lacking here? That's another huge way. But yeah, what Heather's saying is exactly right. It's almost important to have someone from the outside, because let's say you're testing an intervention or a program to see if something works. Well, you're invested in the value of that program working, but you should get somebody on there who's not, right? And say, hey, what are you seeing? Not that they don't want it to work, but it has no intent, no care of it either way, because then what do they see? And it's always very important to have someone on your team that does have some qualitative background. Right, so at least to oversee, you know, what's going on. That may be difficult in these instances, so it's okay. But in the future, it's always a good idea to involve, especially with coding, someone who has some background in actual coding to help you kind of get through things and things like that. And that's, you know, where we've always worked together. So, is
That's helpful.
okay? Cool. I think I attacked it from a number of different points then. Okay, but it's an amazing question. And there's just no, I come from the background, there's no value. Everything is socially constructed. Everything is subjective. There's a reality from everyone. What's happening right now is you have your reality, I have mine, you have yours, right? So it's always going to be that way.
Well, and you know, I mean, I just to back to sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. Okay.
I have trouble sometimes. Sorry, I just couldn't get it out. But even with quantitative data, though, right? You make a whole bunch of decisions about how you're going to handle the data. And you know, I did a study with the national health interview survey. So huge, you know, formally collected data set. And you know, someone else, you know, lo and behold, was working on the same question. And in talking, some of these like seemingly small decisions that you had to make about how to handle the data. For instance, there weren't enough, we were looking at obesity and how it influenced people's colorectal cancer screening. So you're talking about, you know, looking at people who answered the weight question over the age of 50, and we wanted to look at race and gender subgroups. Well, you get down pretty small, and Hispanic, even though it's, you know, a purposely sampled thing, Hispanic was one of the things that got a little bit weird. So do you just leave them out, or if they identify as black or white, do you put them in that group? And the difference in how we handled that data literally gave us each coming out with a different answer to how certain people, you know, certain groups behave, like literally contradictory answers, you know what I mean? So, and those are numbers.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? Like, you know, now we, you know, and had we not kind of caught on to the fact that we were both working on pretty much the same question, we wouldn't have known that. And we couldn't have talked about what that might or might not mean. We would have just both came to the literature and said, here's the answer.
Yeah.
And we would have told the world, you know what I mean? Like the whole
Well,
world.
yeah, I mean, the devil's
Yeah.
always in the methodological
Yeah.
details, but that was revealing in itself, what you found, the two different answers.
Yeah.
You could backtrack to find out what's the
Where that
source
came
of the
from.
problem.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Well, and as you're forming a quantitative study, the question you ask comes from your construct.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's
I
totally-
didn't mean to diverge. from
No,
that.
it didn't diverge at all. No, it's totally, no, exactly, that's exactly what we're talking about. So, you'll probably use a number of those, combo of those things. One of the things I want to kind of back up, though, about is subcoding, which I lump into the kind of second cycle. But basically, think of subcoding or subcodes as you have a major code, a primary code. If you use in vivo, they're called nodes, which is really messed up. Like it's node, and like I teach it as codes, and you're calling it nodes and subnodes, like parent nodes and child nodes. I'm like, oh god. But the lingo alone, you can just make your head explode. But these codes, major codes, let's say you are looking at how patients react to a particular intervention, and you notice that emotions are really involved, and patients' emotions really impact how they engage with this intervention, right? Well, then emotions become a code, a major code. But then there might be fear, there might be anger, there might be sadness or happiness or that kind of stuff. And these all are subcodes of the major code emotions. You have subcodes of happiness, fear, anger, that kind of thing. And then there may even be subcodes off of those subcodes. So you make this kind of tree that's like fear with practitioner or fear with actual procedure, right? Those are two different things. So you have to find how they interact. So fear then becomes a big thing, but it's still only a subcode off of emotion. So this is where it becomes, this is why I like to do it by hand, because I can start building that tree. In the software, however, you can do that and it does it for you. You can see it right there on the left. I'm thinking of in vivo. I can see it right there on the left-hand side of my screen with my codes. It has like just like a heading, a subheading, and then a subheading, right? And you're like, oh, there it is. And they're all different colors, and you can click on them, and all of them come up, and they're beautiful. Then you get my papers that has chicken scratches all over it. But and I also use colored pencils sometimes too. So anyway, subcoding, they link it into first cycle. I purposely link it into second cycle because I think it's more refining. But teach them. The key is do not force. Do not force. Number one issue I have with my grad students all the time is that they force, like let's say you were talking about, these ideas on things, and they want these codes to really be there, and they fish and they try to find them in there. It's not there. It's not there. Can't help it. The data maybe not be there.
Well, the more you try to force, the less you understand
Yeah,
about what's really there.
It throws it completely off. Exactly. Your understanding of what's actually going on. You have blinders on. You have these lenses on that are saying this is what's happening, when in reality it's not. Hence why that sensitivity, you need to kind of let the data speak to you. We'll talk about other kind of things not to do in a little bit. When you're creating and developing your codes, right, your major codes as well as your subcodes, there are two major ways of looking at it. Deductive comes from conceptual predetermined framework. That's going to come from previous literature, your own ideas about things, your hypotheses, right? All those things. Those are like your research questions, your hypotheses, kind of the problems or gaps that you're looking to explore. These are going to be concepts or terms or phrases that you're going to use. You're going to look for as kind of, search when you go find something in a document, right? That's what coding is. Those are deductive codes. And a lot of times, I know in my own research, I use both deductive and inductive. I say, okay, well, previous literature has identified these particular concepts or phrases as probably having an impact on this intervention. So I'm going to use these. However, I'm also going to engage in inductive coding or open coding to see what else might be going on in the data that might be specific to this particular institution or this specific intervention. So it's always good to engage in both. I think it is. Revising codes, all your codes will decay, they will grow, they will be refined through the subcode process as well. These two things are your Bibles, if you will, right? Or your Torahs, or things of that nature, right? The coding scheme it's not a catalog, right? It's more of a conceptual map of your codes, kind of like that tree I was talking about, right? You want to keep a running tally of these things explicitly so that you don't forget what you're actually using. So one way, of course, is the code book as the definitions, long and shorthand that you're using, perhaps. Use these with your memos. But the coding scheme is like how they're starting to connect a little bit, right? It's almost like a spider chart or a tree, however you want to describe it. And as you're developing, as you're coding, these things are starting to become apparent. You don't want to just say, okay, it's all right, I'll remember it later. I engage in that all the time, right? I'll remember that. No. Map it out explicitly. Because that's also going to help you when you're starting to write about your analysis, about how you start to see connections. So coding book and a coding scheme. Keep them. And of course, memoing. Constantly memoing. I do this little notes to myself. I always think that future Barrett is dumb. Like, I always keep that. Future Barrett is dumb. Now Barrett knows what's happening. So I try to go ahead and not hurt my future self.
I do that all the time.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right,
Yeah.
future Heather will not remember.
Yeah, exactly. So when I memo, I'm like, hey, this is starting to smell like this. Like this is something's happening here. Keep an eye on it. Like I constantly do that. That's one of the issues I don't always use with kind of the software. I find that junky. I find that part a little hard to work with. But when I'm memoing, I can just write in the transcripts and circle a big thing and say, hey, something's happening here. And then I can memo that in a side notebook and say, keep your eye on this. And then I go back next time I code and look at things. So it's part seeing connections, and it's part further developing your coding scheme, but also part helping yourself. And that way, when you work with your partners, you can say, here's what I was thinking. Is anyone else starting to see this? Right? Again, it's keeping explicit, detailed notes throughout the process in a number of ways, so as to give you the right to then show the interpretation.
All right, when you're starting out,
Yeah.
how do you know when you're seeing? I mean, like,
Yeah.
at what point do you say, like, yeah, I've seen this enough times, or is it like that's just kind of two random things that are sort of similar? Or
It's a great question, and there's a number of ways. Again, that comes to kind of the feel of it. Like, I mean, I remember my initial time coding, I was real big overarching superficial level codes, like I call it, like surface level, superficial level codes that really had no meat. And then you have to keep on going through the data. It's just exhaustive. So you keep on going through data, and you use the things that you're finding that you think may or may not be anything, and you go through the entire data, all the data with those, and say, is there really anything here? It's basically like I'm using this as a thing that you would just go through, see if it matches, And then you start to see, okay, wait, maybe, and then you start to tease out those connections in your memos or in you start writing out, be like, could, let's say, fear of practitioner and lack of return, like return visit, be connected? Let me go take that and let me look at that. I'm starting to see that, but let me make sure that's happening, consistently in the data, not just for one person.
are you doing all of these? Like, so if you've got multiple of these going on, are you kind of going through and doing one of them, or one or two of them, or do you have all of them going all the time?
Personal preference.
Okay.
And I think that depends a lot on your experience with qualitative analysis. So again, with the software, you could do so many things. But if you're just coding by hand, it may be best the first time around, getting your, really starting to get working with qualitative data, to just do one. It's hard though, because you're going to see other things while you're going on, and you kind of want to. So it becomes a challenge. I kind of say, okay, let me just go through this, but I'll keep my eye open to other things. I'll keep my peripheral open. It'll be very challenging, because you don't know also that if that little connection that I'm seeing with fear practitioner and lack of return for visit, there could be something else to that I'm not seeing because I'm so focused on finding this, but it may help. And also, one quick thing, when I'm coding that way, I purposely, those chunks of data, I make big. I try to take the entire context, not just the line. Where was this said? Who said it? Who are they responding to? What was the question? And I usually circle more than I probably should initially, just so that I can keep the context, because context is key, right? So that's another way of doing it, yeah.
When you're chunking, are you
Yeah.
looking at then refining it from, I'm just saying, from
Yeah.
a sentence to a phrase to a word? I mean,
You can.
I mean, it's not, I'm just trying to get my head around coding.
Yeah.
And
So initially, and the primary code is what I do is anytime, let's say if I was looking at emotions, anything that had anything to do with emotions, I highlight or circle the entire sentence or sentences that relate to that particular phrase. Anything that is like a sentence that just, or what I call the train of thought. I recently had to, in a response to a reviewer, they said that the data that I used in the actual manuscript to be exemplary of the themes I was finding was too big, too much. And my response was, I appreciate that. However, the train of thought is consistent in these examples, and therefore need to be shown so that the reader understands with the context in which this is being said. So you'll know when you're reading it where it's okay. They're on a different topic, or they're no longer speaking about this particular issue. I don't try to narrow it down to codes. To words. Sorry, to words. I try to keep sentences, and I try to keep. I'm more on the side of I keep paragraphs, and until I'm ready, until I'm sure that I've got the essence, that I'm keeping the essence. That's the main thing. You want to make sure you're keeping it. Maybe a word does it, but most of the time you want to keep it.
Do you approach something like a interview differently from, say, a reflective narration?
Yeah.
I mean, how do you look at those different? Because one is somebody saying things in the moment, one's maybe somebody's gone and reflected on something. It's a little easier in med students and other things to kind of task them with, well, why don't you write about what your experience was after you had time to process?
Yes.
Do you approach those differently?
I mean, in terms of data gathering, of course, like when you're gathering data, because I'm gonna be able to ask questions to that student that may charge emotion or get that body language that I'm looking for that may give me even more data. When I'm coding them, however, I code them the same. I make sure that I understand where each came from, but I use the same processes for any kind of, because once a transcript, it's a transcript. It becomes that particular element. But a transcript from an interview, especially one that I've done, is going to have notes on the side that say, during this interview, this person cried, or this person did this, or this happened. So they'll have that, where if it's just the, let's say a narrative essay or a reflection essay, I'll make sure that I have all the details of the time, place, what happened recently, all that stuff, so I understand the context in which this was taken. Because some of that stuff may relate. Like, let's say those students had an exam or a simulation or something like that recently, may impact, right?
Yeah, we took patients out on house calls, and some of them were very engaged, some of them were withdrawn and shell-shocked, but that wasn't taken into account, and it might have been interesting.
Yeah, see, that's exactly right. So that's where that descriptive stuff that I talked about, in the first time, when you describe the situation in where the data took place and how it happened in your sample and what's going on, that's where that comes in major handy, right? So you can see how, especially with qualitative data, to make them valid, especially face valid, you really have to have detailed explanations of everything. Does that answer your question? Okay. So secondary cycle, getting kind of more to the refining age, we're looking for patterns, right? We're pattern coding, looking for things that are occurring more and more often. They could be categories, and this is where you get that theme development a little bit, right? So you're looking for threads that links and tie the data together. Don't do this first. I always tell them, don't go here. Like, don't start with that. You might smell it in the data. You really might. You can see, well, I'm starting to see this. Put it to the side. Write it on your little notes and say, this is what happened. Do not start coding that. Don't rush into that. Make sure, because there could be so many other elements in the data that are happening that may connect with that. So don't go here first. Just wait a little bit. It happens quickly. It really does. And you're going to be so jazzed. You're going to be like, I'm finding it. And then you're going to go right into it, and you're going to rush it. Because it'll lock you. Like I said, it'll lock you right into that. And that's all you'll see. Like, it's just I'm coming from experience here and working with grad students and working with others that do qualitative methods, other professionals, and if you just take the time, it'll be a lot more worthwhile, so don't get locked. But you will do that in the next stage. Once you figure you've got all your major codes, your major subcodes, then start finding the connections between those things. Relationships among people, theoretical constructs, if you're going to do some grounded theory, this is where those constructs will start coming up. I have stuff on grounded theory at the end of this presentation that I will not go into because that's like a class, but I've given you all the information because oftentimes grounded theory is used incorrectly as a term. You can use grounded theory methods, but unless you're developing an actual theory, you're not engaged in grounded theory. Okay, that's the kind of the fundamental nitty-gritty of it all. So people who do open coding often say they're doing grounded theory. Well, where's your theory? Like, the theory is grounded in the data, but if you didn't bring it up, then you didn't do grounded theory. You just did open coding and depth coding. Anyway, don't get locked. Okay, again, don't force when you're finding those patterns. And those patterns, how will you know you're seeing a pattern? It will be consistent. You'll see it in not just one patient or participant, but 10 or 12 or 30. You'll see it, and it'll be similar. The general thing will be similar. You'll start seeing it. That's when you know you're starting to see patterns that exist in different contexts, right? Not just one context, right? Use your code book. When you start making a coding scheme in the code book, look at those code books and those definitions of those codes. Wait, the definition of this is very similar to the definition of this code. Maybe they're very similar, or maybe they're the same thing, right? And then you can start to see, oh wait, these might be connected. Let me go through. Remember your memoing. It'll help you write how things happened, what things you saw. Keep track of how they developed according to you. Remember, you are the tool, and according to your partners in crime, right? Example, the papers I use here, I provide examples of how those patterns were developed in the analysis section. So feel free. I always tell my students, go back to previous data on your topic, look at their analysis section, see how they did it, and feel free to follow suit. You know, that's not a bad way. Again, another reason to be explicit is to help your colleagues in the future. I hate this phrase, but it works well here. There's more than one way to skin a cat. I don't know who invented that phrase. It's terrible. That and
someone who doesn't like.
Yeah, exactly. It's not, you're kicking a dead horse or something. I'm like, jeez, these are like the word. I know they make sense, but jeez. So anyway, there's not one right way. And this really throws people off. There's not one right way of coding. There's a process of coding in which the right way is the most rigorous and most exhaustive and most effortful, and with the least amount of value, of your own personal biases and values, right? That's the right way. But there's no way of actually writing that. I engaged in coding for 20 hours. It doesn't matter, right? It's what you have to do. And what I mean by exhaustive, it's memoing, it's coding scheme, it's coding book, it's that kind of stuff. Pre-code activities. This gets to kind of the idea of bringing things to the table. Do you read? If you're doing exploratory analysis, do you do everything, read all the previous literature you possibly can to maybe get a deductive coding base? Or do you not? Do you just go into it willy-nilly and just say, well, I'm going to see what I see, and then I'll go to the literature, and then I'll come back? You can do it either way. What should be coded? It really depends on your research questions, on your research topic, those types of things. And of course, that will be your demise, right? Because sometimes you'll see things in the data that, like, oh, this is really cool. And it's nothing. It's nothing. Zero, zilch, right? And it just took you in a nice little direction way off your main track. Be careful. Be mindful of your research questions at all times. And I always tell all students and actually colleagues, garbage in, garbage out. The amount of time, just like when you're eating, right, same kind of stuff, if you're coding, you take zero time, zero effort, you want to do it really fast, you're going to get crap data or crap interpretation. Garbage in, garbage out. Pools of meaning, that's what the patterns are, right? And what I like to call the Goldilocks dilemma, sometimes your codes can be too general or they can be too specific. So again, engaging in this multi-stage coding, multi-step coding process allows you to be general and get more specific. Get those big chunks and then refine those chunks down. I'm going to give you a couple quick quotes here. I'm going to go through a few of them. We construct our codes because we are actively naming data, even when we believe our codes form a perfect fit with action and events in the study world. And the key there, of course, is that I'm saying that you are the tool. We construct our codes. We're your team, right? You're constructing the data. It's the interpretation that we believe they perfectly fit, but they don't. But there are interpretations. We may think our codes capture empirical reality. If you're like me, you don't believe there's an empirical reality. Yet it is our view. We choose the words that constitute our codes, right? The definitions we give our codes are our definitions. Again, another reason to use participants to help change that up. Thus, we define what we see as significant in the data and describe what we think is happening. The key is to continue interactions with the data and with the participants, right? Working with both. Is this what's happening? Is this what I'm seeing? Now, personally, when I engage in participatory action research, I wait a bit to engage my participants back in. I wait until I feel I've got some themes or some ideas that are really meaty, and then I say, here's what I think I'm seeing. Does this sound like it's actually happening, or am I off here? and then I'll show them how I got there. That way I'm not giving them, here's all my codes. Could you tell me if these are right? Right? So it's a continual interaction, but it depends on when you want to bring them to the table. When you're coding, frustration, this is how it feels, I swear. Frustrations are good, right? Anxiety is your friend. Struggles are, if you're not struggling, you're not doing it right. And if this was easy, everyone would do it, right? You'd see so much more qualitative data. And then that's what an issue I have is that a lot of people think, oh, it's easy, right? Everyone can do it. No, it takes a lot of training and a lot of experience to actually be good at this. And like I've said in the beginning, some may not be good at this. Writing it up. So let's get to the, okay, we're right on time. Any questions so far? That's kind of a real fundamental point on analysis, real fundamentals. We're going to talk about writing it up now. Yeah.
So I have a question
Yeah.
about who should be doing this if you're not experienced. Should
Yeah.
this be you hire researchers that are kind of experts in qualitative research, or should we try to do it ourselves, or both?
What I would suggest, if you're new to qualitative data analysis, is make sure that you're working with a team, your own research team, and go through it together. I personally think that maybe someone with a little qualitative background would help, but if that's not available to you, if you don't have that resource, then engaging in kind of intercoder activity and participatory coder, or not coder, but going back to your participants and saying, hey, is okay. Okay. But if you have the opportunity to work with somebody who has a qualitative background, you can say, hey, here's 3 or 4 transcripts. Can you tell us what you found? And then if that agrees with what you and your team found, then you're on the right track to some extent, right? But yeah, it's always best to work with someone who knows what they're doing, but at the same time, how do you get, it's like when the kids come out of the job market, right? They want 10 years experience, and like, well, where's I supposed to get that experience, right? And I always tell students, the best way you're going to learn about coding is by coding, right? By getting into it, by learning it through your own means, because everyone's going to code differently, and you got to find your way. All right, so writing it up.
Can I just add my 2 cents?
Mm-hmm.
The way that I did it, I took one class, and then I did a project where Barrett held my hand, and Brian Raymer, the other author on it, so that I had that sort of one formal experience of doing it the way that you should. Mm-hmm. And the caveat that I would add is I think it's fine to say I'm going to try and do this another way, because you don't always have the funding or the or whatever to construct the ideal team around you, or to get maybe you can't find a qualitative researcher who gives a hoot about Lark. So I think it's fine to do what you do, what you can do with what's in front of you. The only thing is I think I would have had a really hard time getting it published without somebody who really had the qualitative analysis experience. I mean, people will see, it's funny, and I've been on the other end on reviews and stuff, and people see through that immediately, like in abstracts and proposals, when someone who is not a qualitative researcher tries to write up, something, immediately they're like, this person's just kind of like willing, you know what I mean? And so anyway.
No, I agree. I mean, like I said, if and when possible, reach out to anyone who might have a qualitative training to some extent, even just to review initial coding processes and help you write up, the methods and the analysis, and how to detail the actual results. I do believe at the same time it is important to get your hands dirty with the data, yourself. So.
It's one more way to increase your own expertise, right? If you've got, and I agree with, I wouldn't farm it out and be like, here, go do my qualitative stuff and then tell me the answer.
Which happened to me a bunch of times.
I think, it's really one more way to solidify yourself as an expert in that content. And so, for instance, if basically you're using it to learn and take a next step, like designing a survey, or you're using it to learn and you want to put that into a grant like we did with a program here, I think that there's a little more leeway there, right? Because you really did it to learn and show. And you are trying to do it to publish or maybe present, and you're going to be coming up against peer review. That's going to be more challenging. It might be you say, look, I don't have the funding to do that. I don't have somebody, but it's enough for me to then put what I learned in the next grant application so that then I can propose to do, formal qualitative analysis and pay at the next step. That's okay.
Does it make more sense then to use the software, because at least then that's software that's validated?
Well, even with this software, you're going to want to have help.
Okay.
Because, again, this becomes a bit of the surface level and then under the surface type stuff. Because initial times when people are first starting to code, a lot of times they'll see is just the stuff right there. And it takes a little bit more training to really dig out, how to develop that coding scheme, that kind of stuff, how to dig it out. It's not that people can't do it, it's just a case, and some are, like I said, better at it than others, even if they've had training. But it regardless, the kind of the working with somebody who's been there, it's kind of like if you did statistical analysis, right? If you only knew correlation and regression, you'd be like, okay, great, but then your project isn't going to be that great if you didn't know kind of even more advanced statistical analysis procedures that someone who actually knows how to do them could help with and walk you through why they matter. It's that kind of thing. Yeah, especially in the beginning. Okay. So writing it up, this is Walker, I'll give you the citation later today. I love this quote. Qualitative approaches beckon because they appear natural, straightforward, even obvious, and thus easy to accomplish. Were it not for the complexity of conceptualizing a qualitative study, conducting the research, analyzing it, and writing it up, perhaps it would be. So, I always look at that, I'm like, yeah, totally right. So when you're writing, it's kind of like when you're writing in general. Where do you do it and why? What time do you do it and why? Like when you write things up, there's anything, not just qualitative data, just anything. Like where do you write? Think about that. Where do you write? Why? When do you write? Do you have a ritual? Do you keep a routine? I like to show students this picture. This is actually when I was writing my dissertation.
Ooh.
Yeah. That chair, I couldn't move. I was in there for about 3 months. I could not move my neck. Like that's how bad this. So don't ever buy that chair for anybody. But I was in there like constantly writing it. But I was like, at the end of it, I really could not even turn my neck. You can see all the papers and stuff like that. So that's where I was writing my dissertation. Right now, I write in my office and things like that, coffee shops. But yeah, I was like, that was not a good place. I look at that now, I'm like, oh God, no, don't take me back there.
It's like a torture chamber.
Exactly.
Full of stuff.
I know, just nasty.
Makes me anxious just looking
But
at it.
yeah, exactly, right?
It
I
really
always
does.
advise, yeah, I know, it's like clean it up, right? I mean, like, man,
Where did you?
get a grip. Like,
Big table.
Yeah, so you have like a big, like one of those kind of bench tables here, and then there's a normal desk here. But what I would recommend to everyone is a dual screen. If you don't use a dual screen yet, I mean, you're missing out on life. Like that is key. I mean, this is the best. These knees. So, but yeah. So anyway,
Is that Napoleon?
That is Napoleon. Yeah. Well, the little plaque says history is a lie agreed upon. So, I was like, pretty amazing. I think it goes with my empirical reality thing. So anyway, yeah. So that was where I wrote for my dissertation. But anyway, I like to show that because it's just chaos, right? It's bad. So when we're talking about analysis, data subjected to analysis are examined and reported through procedures generally understood and accepted in that everyday world among social as well as not so social scientists. The reliability in any sense of the word of such procedures derives from this is the keyboard, derives from the standardization of procedures, not their rightness or wrongness, nor even their appropriateness. So it's the standardization that we talk about in terms of procedures. Again, that's why I tell students, look back at previous research that has done qualitative analysis in your area and look at the procedures they've used and see if there's agreement upon the procedures that have been used. And then since you have a kind of an essence of standardization in that process, right? So we don't judge them in their rightness or wrongness. Now, for particular types of statistical analysis, there is rightness and wrongness, right? Or even appropriateness based upon data. But in terms of qualitative, especially with transcripts or pictures, coding becomes a very ambiguous term. And so rightness and wrongness and appropriateness is not really usable, but a standardization. Are we using the same kind of procedures? In interpretation by contrast is not derived from rigorous, agreed upon, carefully specified procedures, but from our efforts at sense-making, a human activity that includes intuition, past experiences, emotions, personal attributes of human researchers that can be argued endlessly, but neither proved nor disproved to the satisfaction of all. Interpretation invites the reflection, the pondering of data, should be data, of data in terms of what people make them. right? So, and there's a great example of how I use context, right? That's a long quote, and I use the whole thing. Analysis falls more on the scientific side of things, interpretation more on the humanistic side, right? So, again, these are kind of just reinterpreting what I've been trying to say. I apologize for all these quotes, but they give you a background. And also, and when I give you these citations, oftentimes I include citations of Walcott, of Miles Huberman and Saldana when I'm talking about how I did interpretation, when I'm talking about how I did my analysis, right? So these are quotes that I use. A clear statement of purpose is critical for deciding what data need to be reported, what needs to be counted, what relevant literatures to cite, what measures. So basically, a clear statement of purpose, like what your purpose of your study is, right? Your research questions, your research topic, and concise research questions will do that for you as well. When you do turn to analysis, make the dimension of your study as strong and as systematic as possible. That's what I've been saying, right? Just it has to be explicit, as detailed. The justification for your effort. Be factual in what you report. Save the controversial or contestable for your interpretive comments. You might think of the analysis you offer as earning the merit. I always say this: earning the merit that you can later redeem for the opportunity to offer your interpretations. Right? I believe that 1,000%. Sometimes members of a dissertation committee may flat out advise that they are far less interested in what you make of things than with the original data you present and your tentative, close to the best analysis of that data, right? That's more for students, but you get the idea. The point is earn the right with your methods. And I'm going to show you a real quick thing about kind of interpretation and writing it up. And this is more of a coding scheme type thing. I probably should have put this a little bit earlier. I did this. There's a lot of animation in here, and sometimes when you do PowerPoint animation, someone gets away from you. That's what happens. So pay no attention to that. So I'm doing a study on looking at pre-medical students and the pre-med experience, specifically looking at minority students and their experiences. What I found is that when I'm looking at, I've done over almost 200 now interviews with students at different schools. And one of the things, the major themes that comes up in terms of what's a facilitator for their experiences, for positive experience, getting through the pre-med path, is involvement in programs and clubs, like a Making Doctors or kind of the pre-med fraternity or something like that. And I was like, okay, so that's a major code. And I was like, okay, what is it about that? Some subcodes that came out is that these programs and clubs offer advising, informal and formal, mind you, and mentoring, as well as shadowing and research opportunities. They can point students in those directions, right, which are very important for getting those applications out and getting the kind of things they need. Like I said, this advising comes in formal and informal fashions, right? You can already see code, subcodes of a subcode, right? And I have here faculty, staff, and students. We know that formal comes from that level, informal coming from peers, right? And also shadowing, when the shadowing comes through, that gets formal. And I was finding connections there, right? That formal advising. Now, what was it about? What's so good about that formal advising? Well, it has emotional, informational, and tangible support, right? We get intimate one-on-one advising from these formal advisors. There's key players that can kind of make life events happen to some extent, as well as are very mentoring in that way. Real life advising, so doctors that are advising students. Eliminates fear and hesitancy for students. Students often expect in the first year, especially in their second year, they're very hesitant. They're kind of fearful to engage with advisors because they seem as these big kind of intimidating factors. These programs or clubs that students involve in provide a gateway to meeting these people. That's not so, let me go in your office hours, which no student goes to anyway, for a number of reasons. And there you go. General advising is poor, right? So high school, it also helps with the high school and college transition. From the peer level, you get the same kind of thing, emotional, informational, tangible. Intimate advising, right, maybe a senior and a sophomore, lived experiences of the pre-med path, high school, help with the high school, college transition, fear and hesitancy in students speaking with faculty because they can maybe get it from a student, right? So these are all things that I found from this particular major code, and this is kind of a coding scheme in this way. Now, you can see how I've made these linkages and connections already, and you can see almost where the paper is writing itself by this particular level, right? And then we look at, and I look, okay, so I took all of this, and I said, all right, let me take a step back. Went back to the data, and I said, let's see if there's differences between those who engage in these programs and those who don't as often. So then I kind of look at this full heavily, and then those who just kind of do it sparingly. And what I found was that there's actually, this is what was uncovered in that method, there's a stigma associated to some extent, especially within private schools, because this study involved Emory, Vanderbilt, and Duke, as well as Miami, Delaware, and Del State. There was a vulnerability associated with involving these programs from pre-meds on pre-meds, saying, "Oh, you're just part of the game. You're just part of the system, man. Like you're just part of the whole bad thing that's going on with pre-med education." And then there was like being part of the hype. But then there was also this vulnerability of if I go and use this program, well, then I'm not strong enough or smart enough to do it on my own. And then this was key. So this is, when I looked at it this way, we found that those who were not really doing it were not doing it for these reasons, right? And then those who were doing it were saying, yeah, people were saying I'm part of the hype. But so that's where new code kind of came in, right? I'm going to go breeze through this real quick because this is kind of the key here. But peers are also another major code along with this. But I'm finding how they all do this stuff. But anyway, so that's an example of a coding scheme that I use. Well, that it's kind of in process now. Yes.
Barrett, let's say someone else published this.
Okay. How dare they? How dare they? Mine.
And you're doing. You want to follow up, or you have a related question. So you do something. You're not aware of this.
Okay.
You do your research, and you don't come up with those subcodes, those issues in great detail.
Yeah.
But you read this, and you think, my gosh, maybe they were there, and none of us picked up on it.
Yeah.
In the qualitative research world, do you ever see going back to the your original data and looking for something that people just were blind to, and actually seeing a theme come up that was there but not coded?
I don't know. Personally, I haven't gone back and like after I feel like I've kind of completed my codes, I do go back constantly. I believe, and this is part of like the grounded theory approach, is that you're constantly reading studies and books and things like that while you're data gathering and analyzing the data. So you're constantly being informed by the research. And then you're going back to the participants too, so you're constantly being informed. So that's part of that particular process. I have never gotten to the point where I feel like I've saturated the data, or I have what I call, if I'm looking at themes, I have thematic saturation, where I feel things are just coming up over, the same things are coming up over again. I've done it. Like it's gotten to the point where no new information is coming to light from my perspective. I've never then read something and gone like, oh crap, and gone back, because then I feel like I've completed.
I'm wondering if someone else, let's say you didn't pick up on peer advising, right? And someone else did. Yet another study did, and people are wondering in the field, what are the factors that account for peer advising was significant with these students, but not with these students? So then the issue is, well, you go back in the data, and they really were important in both studies. So now the field can agree that this is probably a common factor that's very important.
What I see more often than not is that there is general agreement about overarching major concepts. Maybe not the themes either. So you might find that peer advising, there might be agreement amongst research that peer advising is, but you might see differences in terms of what it is about peer advising. And so some might find that it's the lived experiences of the older students that really gives it the oomph, in terms of my research may find that it's the kind of way they help transition from high school to college. That's what my group really found. And that could just be when there's a couple of ways you could look at that. One would be if it was previous research and I didn't see that, but I'm citing that research when I'm arguing my point, I could say this could be because of my sample. So I'd argue that in my limitations, or I'd argue that in my discussion. Or if a reviewer pointed it out and said, hey, have you read so-and-so? I would go back. I would say, hey, you know what, I'm going to go back. And I'd go and try to find every time I did informal peer evaluation, and I'd look through that.
So that's a check before you actually publish it.
And that's happened to me, where they've said, have you read so-and-so? They found such and such about this. And I said, oh, okay, well, then I've gone back, because the reviewer told me to. But I don't think I found it. And then I argued my sample.
In terms of going back, I thought you said something offhandedly about going back to the subjects.
Yeah, you can definitely do that.
So how does that happen? Do you then you're informed with the themes and you ask them to expound on things, or because kind of looking at this from more the other side, okay, here's your data, this is what you get, this is what you've asked.
Yeah.
How do you go back in without leading the question?
Well, so the way I've done it, I've only done it a couple times, is that I've brought the kind of the themes and their kind of descriptors, back to the participants and said, related upon this, here's what we found. What does this sound right to you? Does this sound like something that's happening, or are we missing the mark? Do you agree with this? And I do it individually. I don't do it as a group. I do it like I'll email them, or if I have their email address, or I will, or I'll try to meet with them. If it's students, I can just meet with them and say, does this sound right to you? That's how I do it. And like I said, I don't bring the whole coding list. I bring the themes. Because then if they say, well, actually, that's kind of how I feel, but I feel more like, this little thing. And someone else may say, it's this little thing. But it doesn't matter because that main theme is the same. They're just saying there's little nuances between, and I will note those nuances in my discussion.
So it's more of a check rather than a recoding based on
But you
bringing your
could.
data.
You could recode it. You could say, okay, I've got the theme before I go back to the data, or even after I've gone back to the data with that theme as a code. I will go to the participants and get more subcodes and more detail as to what could be happening. You could do it either way.
Okay.
It's a good check. It can be a check, it can be a code, it can be all those things. And not one right way. It also depends on your time. So with interpretation, do not over-interpret. Do not take it too far. If it's not there, it's not there. And how you know if you're over-interpreting, is the data telling you this, or are you telling yourself this? Right? Rely on the data. And that's why I use that context. So when I say things in papers, and I put that quote in there as an example, I wish I could use like 1,000 examples, but they only allow me to use one or two. It says this in this context. This is what I interpreted. Here's where you can see exactly what I'm doing. But that connection makes it, that is a difficult thing to show in your paper, those linkages. So if you're talking about, like when I talk about the knowledge gap in one of those papers, I'm talking about a knowledge gap between med students when they first start and then we'll say layperson, people not involved in medicine, right? And I say from the start, there's a knowledge gap because immediately they're invested in medical school, all the knowledge they're learning about clinical aspects of health, lay people aren't getting those. So immediately there's a gap. And then in that paper, what I argue is that gap is then exacerbated by stress of medical school, as well as the being in school all the time, only surrounding themselves with other med students, and then elements of the hidden curriculum, which you guys can read about. But showing how I made those connections in the interpretation can be challenging, because what you have is here's 1 point, here's point 2, here's point 3, and you have to show how you move between them with quotes. Because there may not be someone saying explicitly, oh yeah, man, like they don't know what I'm talking about, and that gap is getting huge based upon, the stress I experience and what's going on. No one's told the exact story, but you can see the story that's there, and you have to connect the dots.
So, I was kind of surprised because, in each of these, there's a whole lot of quotes.
Yeah.
And so, other research that I've read,
none.
There are no quotes.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of intrigued, I didn't know what to do with your quotes.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
So then I start sitting there asking myself more questions. And I think it goes back to then how far or, when do you go back and say, okay, if I read this in 6 months or a year from now, those quotes may spark a whole different set of questions than they sparked for me yesterday.
Yeah, exactly, because of what you've experienced in your own kind of research and things like that.
So then how often would someone research what you researched?
Okay, so if I'm thinking about medical education and I'm interested in the impact of the hidden curriculum, it's a pretty hot topic, right? There's a few, I wouldn't say it's hot in my world, but how many times, so people consistently are researching that area, and I'm consistently getting cited. But I'm getting cited for my findings, which is actually my interpretation. So, I found that the hidden curriculum impact, let's just say emotions, let's just say that, right? Empathy. That's a study about, right? It impacts empathy. Well, now, anybody who's writing about empathy and maybe the erosion of empathy of medical students over time will more than likely, hopefully, cite my work based upon my finding. Now, they may use that as a way of saying he found that hidden curriculum impacted empathy through A, B, and C. They may not use that specific, but they may use the general theme of what I found. You see what I'm saying? So, and if they use the specifics, they may use those as codes in their own research, or they may not.
Okay, so that's where they could use some of that then to
Exactly.
for their own code.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's why, again, why I try to be as explicit as I have been as possible with my codes, so that people can see what I did. And if worst case scenario, if they had to replicate, you know, just like you want to do with, like, there's no one does this anymore, but if they wanted my data and they wanted to replicate, they could, because they'd have the procedures right there. That's how I think of it. And no one would, but then you got to think, more than likely they won't find exactly what I found. Hopefully they'll find the general themes that I found, but because they're their own person coming from their own background. And that's one of the issues we have. Replication is a huge issue with qualitative methods, right? Because you're your own interpretive tool. Don't jump, right? Don't start talking about your concept, your category, theme, and then talk about something you think seems relevant, because it'll just distract you. So don't overinterpret it and don't jump. Don't start flesh an argument out completely. Just get it to where it's bare bones. Like, take all the meat off it, and then you can move on. Right? Don't be like, oh, now we're talking about this. No, just stay with your topic. Set your points up and then knock them down, right? Do not try to explain everything you found. You will have so much data in your focus groups and your interview transcripts and all those things that you will find so much stuff. Remember, your research questions and stick to one or two things. You can always write a second paper, but try to just stick to your topics, right? And again, there's Miles and I'll talk about that later. Some things you can watch out for, right? The holistic fallacy. Interpreting events as more pattern and congruent as they really are, lopping off many of the loose ends of which social life is made. Sloppy research, right? So again, over-interpreting. That's a holistic fallacy. Elite bias, overweighting data from articulate, well-informed, usually high-status participants, and underrepresented data from less articulate, lower-status ones. Now, this is something to be interested in if you are engaging in participatory action research, but also I do this with patients in terms of I make sure that I'm paying attention to everyone involved in the study, right? And I'm not just using quotes that, you know, that first from the people that, because they sound better, they're easier to read. Everything, if there's something that relates to it, you can use it. And so one of the things I do that I get in trouble for from reviewers, I include likes, I include everything. Because that is the context in which it was said, right? That is data. I do not manipulate any data. Also, pauses can be extremely important. So when you're transcribing, or if someone else, make sure you say, include pauses. Because somebody could be thinking about thinking, I have a great quote, I don't have it on here, I have a great quote from a med student where they're thinking about something, and all of a sudden they pause and they do a 180. And it's exactly, I'm showing the conflict that students may have about something, and it just, that pause shows it. It shows that they're like, you know, that kind of stuff is key. So really be cognizant of all of the filler, because that can be real, that's data. Personal biases, the researcher's personal agenda, personal demons, or personal axes to grind, right? If you have an intervention that you don't want to work, or you want to work, watch it, because you'll find the data that fits that, which skew the ability to represent or present fieldwork data analysis in a trustworthy manner. And of course, going native. Losing your perspective or bracketing, or your bracketing ability, being co-opted into the perceptions and explanations of local participants. So you will have to try to allow, and I say be vulnerable and being sensitive to your participants, but watch it when you're coding the data, because you might want to show that, let's say, patients really have a hard time with this, and they may not. And you're like, but look, and you're really strong. Just be cognizant of what you're doing, of your own biases. Again, more coders help you go do that. This is the one thing that a lot of people do, is they overinterpret. So other checks that you can do to make sure your data is clean, or your analysis and your argument is clean. Checking for representativeness, making sure that you're not just hitting it from a couple participants, but from most. Checking for researcher effects, those ones I described earlier. Triangulating, so if you have observation data, interview data, and something else, making sure they all agree with the same things you're finding. You're looking at extreme cases, making sure you're not just using extreme cases, but then comparing what you found to the extreme cases, right? Looking for negative benefit. Go through your data. Once you've found stuff, go through and see, does anything disagree with this? And if it does, where is it? Making if-then tests, ruling out spurious relationships, making sure you're not missing a code in that relationship. replicating findings, which we don't do enough in qualitative data, checking out rival explanations. So again, it goes to your point, right? If someone else brought up something else, let me see if that actually is in there, and getting feedback from participants. These are all checks and balances you can engage in.
Garrett,
Yeah.
Could you speak 1 second longer on you're highlighting representativeness,
Yeah.
but then you focused on extreme cases.
Oh, I say don't focus on extreme cases. What I advise that people do is they use extreme cases as a comparison. So once you found it, and you say, okay, most people are doing this, look at the ones that are not doing it, or that are very extreme. So if you have, like, you're finding a theme that's consistent for everybody, but one particular participant takes it in a very far manner, you're probably not going to use that, per se, unless everyone's, the majority are saying that. But make sure you look at that. Make sure you look at that extreme case in either side to say, what are they saying? And am I not going far enough in my interpretation? Is there more there? So don't let it be your bread and butter, but definitely pay attention to it. So don't, and it says using extreme cases, I should have put as comparisons. I put it that, my bad. But you're using them for what they are. And what you may find is that there might be more to your analysis or your code. Maybe you didn't pay enough attention to that, that kind of thing. So they can be very annoying, and you can write them off very quickly. I've heard of qualitative researchers that when they find an extreme case, they just throw it to the side. They don't even code it. And I can see how you could do that in the beginning, but then bring it back at the end and code it and see what you could be missing. So there's a way of doing it, or code it and see maybe there's more, especially in the beginning. Is that help answer? Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And when we read the reports, they are most often heavy on what, the findings, the descriptions, and rather thin on the how and the what. In most cases, how you got to the what, excuse me. In most cases, we don't see a procedural account of the analysis explaining just how the researcher got from 500 pages of field notes to the main conclusion drawn. Researchers are not being cryptic or obtuse. It's just that there are few guidelines for explaining to their colleagues, sorry for all the typos, what they did and how, in all fairness, the page limit what they did and how. And in all fairness, the page limit for journal articles also forces researchers to briefly sketch their methodological paragraphs. That's true. That's a kind of a structural issue. But this is one of the main key things when I say we have to be as explicit as possible, because you don't want to go, a lot of people say, here's what I found. But I want to know how you got there. I mean, I kill students on dissertations. I mean, I cost them months sometimes, because I'm like, go back. You got to tell me what you did. In dissertation, you can be much more, verbose. But, even when I'm reviewing articles, I say, I don't know if I can trust this analysis or this interpretation, because I don't know what they did. And a lot of times they'll say, we use a grounded theory approach. I'm like, you have no idea what you did, is what you're telling me. When people just throw that out there and they don't give me a theory or they don't show me what that means, I get very upset. Okay, so using your research questions, lit reviews, conceptual framework, all these things, these are how kind of the paper goes. Always think about what kinds of qualitative design you use, because you're going to want to talk about that. What sample decisions were made, that's something that you always have to think about when you're writing up your methods. What does your instrument look like, and how do you know it's valid? That's another thing. If you're using a guide for focus group questions, how do you know that those questions are actually getting at your research questions, right? Or interview questions, same way. How are the data aggregated, condensed, partitioned, displayed, analyzed? What all this stuff has to be discussed. How did you get from all those field notes, innovations, object notes to your final report? These are all the things that you have to talk about, in your kind of methods and analysis section.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Always make running notes of your procedural steps. I'm sorry, that's an assignment I had a student do. And then my examples, of course, like I said in those papers, feel free to use those as examples. Again, because of limitations and page limitations, they're not as detailed as they probably should be. But that's what I could do at the time. And honestly, I think even in Flow, we were asked for more details. So this is something that I like to finish off with, and with just enough time, too. And I'll give you this site in a little bit. You can tell I love PowerPoint. I like to do things with PowerPoint. So, notion of cautious detachment. This is when you're writing up your findings. And I always say, be cautious and detach yourself a bit from your statements of this is what's happening, right? Using hedging statements. We suggest, it appears to, it seems to, right? again, as someone who believes there's no empirical reality, that it's all constructed, what you found is what you found. Someone else may find something. So it seems to be, it appears to be. It not is, never is. There's no is. Setting a cautious scene, right? In many cases, often, many of which, that is the terms that I use. Making restrained sense. For instance, data such as, at other times. Again, using the comparison as well, right? You say, here's what I found. Now, there was this, right? I've done that as well. Be careful with people's words. Like I said, I use ums, likes. I get killed on it every time with reviewers. They're like, could you please tighten this up? I say, no. Because then I'll be manipulating data. Different people will say, no, I clean it up. And then I feel like you're not using their voice the way their voice came out. Suspending judgment about what you found, right? And I always say, have an exit strategy for your data. This has come across, it was not with this particular paper, but with Flow or any of these other papers, but there have been collaborative experiences that I've engaged in where I had no exit strategy for my data. And I was like, boom, here you go. And people were like, no, we're not going to be using that. Because it was not, they had different interpretations of the data. I'll just put it that way, right? My findings are my findings. I don't care if they cause your house to explode, right? The idea being, you could be the best qualitative researcher and you could have the most detailed processes of coding and analysis. However, especially working in groups and maybe working to evaluate programs, there are people in mind that have values and ideas about what they want to find, right? And I'm not saying everyone does. And I've worked with groups who I've found kind of negative findings of a program, and they've been like, oh, sweet, thank you, we've been looking, that kind of thing. Just be careful. That's what I'm saying. Have an exit strategy. So if you are engaging with your participants and you find something that happens where the participants are actually doing something detrimental, where you have to say, well, this could be one of the reasons why this intervention is not working out, and it's, let's say, the participant's fault. I'm not saying that's going to happen. You have to find a way to discuss that with your participants and saying, hey, here's this. And that comes with your discussion of, next steps in programs and how can we make this better, right? So your exit strategy usually is your future research suggestions, your ideas for new interventions, how to better programs, that type of stuff. Right? So I say this because I'm putting this in terms of cautious attachment because you have to be overall, it's so hard. You've gotten so close and so intimate with your data. You're going to have to kind of, what we call Harry and the Hendersons, right? Like kick it away. It's no longer your baby anymore. Right? You have to, it could be somebody else's project that you were brought onto. It could be yours, but you have to move on. Right? You've gotten so used to this. Also, you've gotten so intimate with your participants that you have to find a way to move on, right? So always have an exit strategy with your project, but also with your data. And that should be somewhere, happening while you're coding to some extent. And just be careful. I'm not trying to be jaded or anything like that. I'm just saying be careful. These things can come out when you're using people's words. Watch people's words. Sometimes they say things and they don't realize they're saying them. Okay, and that can be difficult too. And you're like, well, this fits. This is a great exemplary quote. I'm going to throw it in this publication. And you're like, well, you signed a consent form. It gets nasty. Okay, so interpretation of argument. We have just enough time for this. This is the fun part, right? This is where you get to stay. Here's what's happening. Let me tell you. This is your argument. So you have your argument, which is the main driving force of your discussion section. So we've talked about writing up your methods, writing up your analysis, showing your interpretation, and now here's your discussion section, right? How do you send that up? And in terms of data extracts, okay, you can see from those papers there's a number of different ways of doing it. I prevented it where here's a point, here's some data. Here's a point, here's some data. Here's the argument, right? The whole thing is the argument. Other ways of doing it, here's a table. Here's what I found, blah, 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 blah. Here's a table showing you those quotes, how many times they came up, right? Number of different ways of doing that. There's not one right way. It really depends on the journal and your editors and your own personal preference. The discursive commentary tells the reader which bits of each data extract are significant and why, right? So you're saying, I'm using this, here's this point, here's what it means, here's why it connects. So the way I look at it, is I'm very visual, right? I see it as a conductor, right? You're the the conductor is the argument, and this is the data, right? So the argument is being made, and it's conducting, that's showing the data putting where the data is. So the theme, so we could say this is the theme, right? The basis upon which the argument, the data extracts, and the discussion and commentaries are organized. So here's the theme, here's all that other stuff, right? Providing organization, so it provides you your headings, all those things, subheadings. So this is all that stuff, the argument, the data extracts, all the discursive commentaries, and here's the theme. But, getting back to our original point, right, you have that, but you are the one that's controlling all of that. So always keep that in mind, right? So you are the one that's controlling the theme and then all these other points. So
That's
organize
sort of
it.
a scary picture.
I know, right? I know.
A little scary.
I love PowerPoint. I love it. All right. Oops. Okay. Approaches to organize your writing. Set of individual case. Actually, I don't need to go through this because it's all right there. You can see all those examples, and you can read any qualitative data. You'll see that most often there's a general idea of presenting a point, data, cohesive statement of argument. Others do it differently. It is essential that we are aware of the representation of reality, whether on note cards or in chapter headings, which is produced by the researcher, should not be confused with the social reality that inspires research. I'm going to keep on harping on that point. So you may be tempted to keep data as pure, as raw as you can. That gets to the argument in terms of how do you present those data extracts. It is essential to success in writing about data to understand why raw data cannot simply be left as is. You can't just put it there without telling the reader what you did with it or what you saw in it, and why the researcher must organize it and develop a strategy for writing about it. So appreciate that your data is already different than the social reality, and therefore you must demonstrate explicitly how you found that stuff in the methods. A little more raw, a little more than the raw data is presented, then your argument is not presented, right? You have to. So you've made your argument in the analysis. You then, in the discussion, have to paint that picture. You have to show the argument to the reader, right? That's another way of kind of convincing the reader of what you found, right? So here's raw data, right? You've got to do that in your analysis, and then in your discussion, you do that. Right? I use these visual things to help me understand how something actually works. Right? All right. Often themes have been growing within the researcher's mind through the whole research process. Researchers often know the character of the data regardless of formal analysis. It is, after all, largely a product of their own thinking during the research process. So the big thing here being that you probably know what you're going to find based upon your previous knowledge of the topic, of your engagement in the methods in the field. You probably have an idea already what you're going to find. Don't stop there, though, right? So just remember this theme and the idea of how the theme works when you're writing it up. But you are I don't know why, I did it twice because I like to scare people, right? Okay. Much scholarly writing consists of arguments, whether explicit or implicit. Ostensibly straightforward data analysis rely on arguments and invoke rhetorical devices from them. We persuade readers to accept a new theory or interpretation. This is the so what factor. Who gives a crap about what you did? Why should I care at all? You did all this work. Your discussion of your argument, your presentation of themes, or categorical themes, or themes that are categorical, however you want to describe it, you have to say, why this even matters? Why do we care? So you found this great stuff out about this particular intervention or program. What does that mean? This program worked. So, what does it mean for other programs like it? What does it mean for the patients themselves? How can it be further interpreted? How does your data help you inform about these next steps? So what factor is something that is greatly missing in a lot of projects. So your argument is the key thing. It helps you form that so what factor. You'll have to wrestle with your material. You create your arguments for points that are embedded in the data, and it's work. But it's fun. This is your perspective. This is your thing, and your colleagues, right? This is your stuff. This is your project. It can be fun. So here's some things to help you find those arguments. What sense of this process or analysis do you want the reader to make? What do you want the reader to know? Why is it significant? You have to make this explicitly clear, right? Don't assume that the reader knows what you're talking about. The reader didn't gather the data. You may be making jumps and assumptions because you know the data. What did you tell your readers what you intended to do, and did you actually do that? In what sentences or paragraphs do your major points coalesce? All right, make sure that's abundantly clear. And yes, you will have sub-arguments, but assess how closely they are aligned with your main arguments. Don't overdo it. Don't worry too much about that. We're going to finish on these last 2 slides. The plagues of qualitative data and arguments in qualitative data. Vague statements that have no real grounding. Again, so what? Like, don't buzzwords. Oh my God, buzzwords. Stop. Like, tell me what they mean in the data. Overgeneralizations, logic gaps, weak arguments, leaps, forces, all these things, and just general laziness in qualitative data. Again, it comes down to the point where everyone thinks they can do it because it's qualitative data, just touch and feel. These are the plagues. So, I always say, slow down and chew your data, right? Take your time with your data. This will prevent these types of things. Take your time with it. Once you have it, treat it gently, right? Engage with it. Don't just go to the surface level and that's it. Take your time and chew it consistently. Right? Be mindful of what you're finding. Keep those notes. Right? I think that's it. I'm not going to go into grounded theory because that's a whole class. So I'm leaving the notes with this so that you all have them. So when you're thinking, when you're just like, I'm going to do grounded theory, look at this first. Go through those slides first. Because there's a very distinct differences. There's actually a number of ways of looking at grounded theory. There's Glasser and Strauss, Glasser and Corbin, and Sharmaz. Sharmaz taking it and kind of giving it to everyone. It's like the let them eat cake thing. But there's more to it. So just be careful. I went over a lot of stuff. So any questions? Is the skeptic? Yes.
The phrase overgeneralization implies that it's okay to generalize.
You almost have to.
But as an outsider, I thought that qualitative researchers stand on this holy grail that we're not doing research to generalize to a population. And that's often a defense that I receive when I say, but you have so many specifics here that are unique to this situation. How can, we're not discovering generalizable truths, we're discovering only what you found at that point in time with this group of people in that location under these conditions.
Right, and so that's actually, I've almost had a verbatim reviewer say that to me about my qualitative methods for a particular paper. And the idea there is that that really formulates through your questions that you're asking these people, right? So if you're asking about a particular intervention, their perceptions of an intervention or a program, right? You're asking questions about, tell me about your experience. That's a very general question, right? Tell me about your experiences with the program. And then you get more and more in detail about their particular specifics. That individuals, like say you're doing an interview, specifics about that. But if we find that participant A and participant H and D and G and a number of other ones, they have very similar experiences in terms of how they're describing them. And there's a general finding there about the patients of this intervention. Now, could we then say that patients of similar interventions in other institutions are having no, we can't do that. Because the context is going to be different in those other institutions. But we can say this is something for further research. Now, if I had a study where I was studying...
And reviews are good with that?
Yep.
Okay.
But if I had a study where this is where, your sample definitely helps them. For every study, more sample, better, right? If I was studying institution A, B, and C, that were scattered across the nation, let's say, and I had, a sample of 15 in each, and they all, let's say at least a high majority had similar experiences, then I can start saying, look, I've looked at these different contexts, and they're all saying the same kind of things. More than likely, this is something that's happening. But yeah, if you're only having one setting or one intervention, then your sample size is anywhere between 15 to 20.
You qualify.
You qualify your findings. Yeah, exactly. So you just can't. Again, that comes in with when you're making your argument and you're saying, well, this is happening to everyone. No. You can't say that. Right? That happens with everything. Know your sample. Anything else? Awesome. Well, Heather has my my email address. They're also on those papers, I'm sure. Any critiques about those papers are surely welcome, but they're published, so. Haven't had it. But yeah, if anybody needs any help with anything, feel free. I'm around. I'm just over at UD, so and I'm here a lot. So any questions for me then or later, just feel free to ask. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just had a quick question.
Sure.
So I pulled up kind of an article in a medical journal that we would maybe eventually want to submit.
Mm-hmm.
And thank God they don't require the detail in the data analysis description.
Give it to them anyway.
That you
For your own
mentioned.
sake, yeah.
Okay, but they do mention using standard text analysis as their method. Is that?
That's a nice buzzword.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a buzzword.
Okay, it's a nice little buzzword. So standard text analysis, I mean, it could be anywhere. Again, that could be cite a major like Miles Uberman in Zaldana, Walcott Holiday, citing these major players that talk about a particular procedure that they say is valid way of analyzing. It could also be citing a standard procedure, meaning like so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so have used a similar procedure in their analysis of similar data, of being explicit about what that data is. So that's, I feel, is one of those buzzwords, one of those catch-all terms that we have to be careful of. But I will say this, if the journal that you're looking about is cool with a nice bare bones type approach to analysis, for your own sake, write it as explicitly as you can. You can always tone it down, but if you go to a presentation, and God forbid there's someone like me in that audience, I'll be like, I don't trust you, tell me more, and you'll have it all written down and be like, boom, here it is, right? So that's the best way of doing it. It comes from the sociology studies or presentations that I give, and someone's like, yeah, now this doesn't make sense to me. Now I have to go back and tell you everything. Hope I didn't forget. Okay? All right. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Whatever you're sending out.
So
I get
quick
it.
5 minutes,
Thanks,
and
Brad, I
then we will
appreciate it.
recoup, and we'll finish up the finale here on Are We Ready and on the ACE curriculum. Stand up, stretch, go to the bathroom, not whatever, return an email. I always need a little mental.
We have
name.
Omar and Michelle all online.
Okay.
They've been on the whole time.
Can you guys hear okay? Omar and Michelle and Tim?
I'm good with it. 'Cause
Come on, guys, don't make a liar out of me now.
Oh, no problem. My pleasure.
Maybe they're taking the break already.
Oh, hey. I appreciate an open mind, man. That's the best thing.
And I want to be.
That's good.
Not still
Well,
that
when I send these
Kills
resources,
me.
I mean, I can come up there. If there's
What research are you doing now?
space, place.
Yeah, no.
to digest. So, excellent.
The project I'm trying to,
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, exactly.
informed decision making.
Schools.
Me too.
So I appreciate your work.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well,
I
great.
don't-
Really is the first time.
Well, I kept it on my calendar for.
Yeah, no problem. Would you mind if, of course. I'm over in I'm on the office, now Aaron's office is over on Amstel, but I'm in Smith. So, yeah, we're out. Swing by the office. Yeah, exactly. Thanks, man. No problem. Thank you. No problem. And feel free to email me as well.
I will.
If you need someone
Don't worry.
to review your stuff, okay?
I can get something
See you all
over there.
later. Bye-bye. I'll be in touch, okay?
I mean, so I can get a room there.
I just emailed it.
All right, so let me look at something.
FEC biostats person that is helping us.
Okay.
Like,
I was just thinking about
do you
that.
want it to go? And she's like, no. And I'm like, well, what do you guys use? And I'm writing stuff up. I need to say, like,
All right.
I didn't even know you could put it in a tool.
Yeah.
I just thought you could put it in and kind of did it yourself.
For the exact period of time that he was
No
gone
problem.
from Emory. So he was at Emory before I got there,
No,
and then he
that's
went back
great.
to Emory right after I left.
His suggestion
So
is
Farmer was like,
trying to do it.
No, I think we're gonna
Okay.
do both.
Really?
Because then that'll let us know
Yeah.
if the tool data tool is something completely different
You're
than
the
what
one
we
that's gonna have
did.
to write about
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
So,
But
it'd
I
be good to say, well, Bill said it was okay.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
I could use this,
Right, so
I
no,
think
but
that'll
it's,
make a big difference to you. But
yeah. And then, but looking at what's published, they do mention a tool, and I think that if you're somebody that's not known for this, then saying that.
I always
you
think
use
about
the
that, I'm like, it was like a
tool.
weird reversal, I'm used to being
I
the
mean,
one.
they
to
mentioned the
ask
tool, but then they said
questions.
that, and they also mentioned the names of the
You know,
resources
and
that they
sometimes
did and the
I'm
iterator
have I forgotten
reliability,
that
so
you
they
can
mentioned.
What it's like to be on the other side, yeah.
So you're gonna try to look at what's happening and was published in our
I think the most fun part of your entire project, unless you have a really, really happy participant,
Know about it.
that you enjoy talking to all the time,
More quantitative.
is going to be looking at what you learned and can we make sense of it, you know, kind of thing.
Yeah, I
So
did.
I don't
I
want you to
did.
cut yourself out of the fun part.
Oh, yeah, no, I
you know,
think.
No, but I'm
I
just
think
saying,
we
like,
get
we
the
don't
council on
have
one of
any,
the
I mean,
things
our
that I'm
team is
hoping to be able to share
Jane and I,
I did like a
Yeah,
and
but
the
I only know,
president,
like,
so we don't have anybody on our
Valerie
research
Carey.
team that is an expert
So I
in
gave
this
that to Lynn and
issue.
Jen Rederizer for them to look at and give me
And
some
again, we have a biostats
feedback.
person.
I would have still been up for this one, but I would have been looking at the
Everything
other
that
one.
you see.
Kind of write the verbiage that was in our grant, and I forgot
I'm thinking about piloting next year, something different.
Well, the quantitative part is where the EpiBio person can help you with.
Yeah.
They're gonna help you with their, you know, out of 30 people, there were 27 that did this, 4 that did that, there were, you know, kind
But
of.
she also wrote the qualitative
That happen.
section too. She
We're
wrote the
gonna
whole
do northern.
data.
I'm
We
gonna do
have no idea, we don't, in our proposal.
Sure.
Yeah, because we're like, we don't know what that is. write something and see, so I have to see what, now that I understand, like, and then she wrote something and we didn't know,
Yeah.
we didn't understand what she wrote because we didn't know anything about it.
Yep.
Now I can go back and look at,
Well, remember there's a difference though between qualitative and quantitative.
Right.
That was the hardest thing for me working with Brian.
yeah.
Okay, when
And I'm
Brian was
gonna
looking
have,
at,
I'm gonna.
quantitative, which is just the numbers. This is,
Right.
we have a spreadsheet of everybody's responses, we have so many check marks and so many columns, and this is an analysis.
I'm gonna just call
Okay.
it.
They have their own.
Yeah, no,
language.
it's been good once I've been here. It was just, I knew that there were a couple ones.
Right.
Different
Or
language that gets into all kinds of qualifiers that reviewers would turn around and ask you,
So what
okay,
we
based
do-
on conclusion on, you know, how do you make that be logical?
I do worry
Okay,
that,
and
you
they
know,
have a long list
remotely
that
there's
says,
something
we
like
can put right in the bottom of
realistic.
the
You doing other
This
stuff.
comment has this degree
And the other thing is I
of
want
proof,
to still take some face
and there's a term
Yeah.
that they use, and they tell you in advance
So what I thought
the
is
formula
we
we
would
use, we get to that total.
Right.
That's
and
strictly
you
the
know,
numbers data.
Right.
Their questions
But
may be
however we're gonna
qualitative
identify
and your
it,
insight may be
where
really
it's more of your interpretation and taking into account all the who, what, where, as opposed to just the
overall.
numbers.
Right.
We'll be able to track.
That's the
Experience, yeah,
part
just
where
So,
somebody like Alex, that like,
Next week,
Let's talk about that next week a little bit.
as,
Oh,
you know,
good.
what is that capture?
We really
Yes.
want
Barrett.
to
Oh, I should have,
okay, somebody like Barrett,
totally
okay,
together,
working with
work on a
you,
survey, so that we can get that.
your
Yeah.
opinion is validated.
As much as the
His
verbiage
style
is,
for how
you
you
know, what we want to
present that.
utilize,
Right.
kind of
Opinion
like,
is what's
you
gonna
know,
happen.
so that we can
So-
just start taking people meeting.
Dinner.
I should
Like,
have asked him
it's
the
just
words
value.
that she used
But
in
other
our
than that, like,
grant, where was
This is why you're going.
90% of
Okay.
my meals
Like I said,
are
she's the FA
in
So
some
are we
form.
gonna use
She's probably talking about.
No, she wrote both.
Yes, yeah, we should do
Quantitative.
that.
I was a
Because we
little
didn't know
bit
anything, like
hesitant
anything about
about
data,
it,
so
but
she,
they said,
Okay.
about it.
wrote
I mean, it's,
Validated.
I think,
And
yes.
this was,
And then looking
I
at it a
did
little more, like I said, I was
my
stuck on it because I'm like, well, I like the
residency
evidence
and then a
is
fellowship
find
at
out
Jefferson.
who these people
Yeah,
really
she
need, these people
mentioned
really want
things
it.
that I
So
still
it's
don't
stuff
mean,
like
that
that.
was
So
my
it's like
that I can
resume
email
letter.
him
informing
She
that.
left
say.
in
But
my
in terms of just
fellowship
general
here, came down here as the
palliativeness,
chair, so when I was
Okay.
looking for a job, I
I think
called her.
Bill's a little bit better.
And so then I
Yeah,
took the
I
job.
looked at it again and I just think it's,
And I've been
I looked at it again.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
initially I was
Still
looking, like,
understand.
it's too hot.
Oh, yeah.
I looked at it again, I'm like,
Looking
yeah,
back
parts
to
of
see
it
what
are,
because
but-
the
but
EpiBio
parts of it
good, but not
wasn't. And like, and, you know, that was
Qualitative
like,
analysis
we got
in
rid of
our
it.
Yes, which was very
helpful.
Yes,
Let's use
but
Right.
even after his lectures, looking at what she wrote, I still don't understand. I should have asked him about that. I still don't understand what any of
I think a
it
lot of people
means.
probably have
Because she used terms that
they keep for
Right, that
years.
was way
that he
above
still
my
hasn't
grade.
even. Yeah, but they're still above
When
my
I first started
career.
working with
Yeah.
Brian,
Other professors
he would
have
sit and
said
talk
they
to me
change
very
a lot.
conversationally and
I think
things,
they kind of
but
tend
he
to settle
used
low
all
by
that
the nature of
terminology
Right.
as though it was common knowledge.
Right.
So he and I went back and forth until he realized where was I, and how does he bring me to the point where, you know, what he's saying is now English.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't even know if she knows what she's talking about. Yeah, she was saying additional logic branching. She didn't mention anything about
from
uh,
IRB.
Oh, I've been working on it.
So you're doing, okay,
Total
you're working
line.
on focus groups, so yeah, it doesn't, yeah.
Okay, I'm rarely there.
These guys, every time I get a
Why do you-
voice roll,
Nice.
and they just move right up.
Oh, yeah, I love that.
It was fine, it was great.
When I'm going like on rollers,
Okay.
my mind up.
Okay.
Holy crap, I never go over 25.
No, that's,
I know.
but I was
So,
gonna
but
do,
I was
like,
I mean,
you had asked about
respect.
citations, but I can't,
You
I don't
know,
wanna
I
give
could
opinions
just
based on the last
I
draft.
have no idea, so I'm gonna give them wine, or
So,
I was thinking like a
okay.
amaretto or a liqueur of some kind.
This many people voted this many ways.
And,
But you're always
no.
But they get good recommendations.
Spencer and I.
She didn't really
The
put
problem I have with
any.
Total Wine is it's so huge. It is. I mean, I live closer to two
Like we would probably
smaller
use this class.
Yeah, and I saw you, yeah.
But now I know.
Many experts,
But now I know.
you know?
That was my first, I went to your.
Yeah.
Whether we understand.
Yeah.
All right, so
Yeah, but we have to understand it or like write it
It's always
into
great.
the IRB.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, last Thursday you sent me
And how that correlates. I understand what
Okay.
you said.
Okay.
And I'll start throwing the citations in.
And in the medical journals,
And boy, it's been years because I'm not close to there. I'm up in
in the full
Pennsylvania.
text journal,
But,
not just the abstract
but
of it.
they always
They don't get
Yeah.
very detailed into
Yeah, just let me know when you guys are.
data analysis methods.
Right.
Is it?
Okay.
Okay.
And, you know, if we kind
So it
of,
makes it common, it's not like.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
so in the.
Okay.
But they have a huge
down there
selection.
college.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Vivo,
Okay, yeah.
researchers,
Yeah.
they said who the
No?
researchers were, they said that they kind of integrated reliability and
Oh.
That's it, and it wasn't
That's
like
good.
a lot of, even like, if you're trying to be upfront of the model change, everything kind of public health social behavior research.
Oh, there you go,
And
well.
not
Okay.
stuff
Flattering.
that-
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, that's cool. I like that.
Care about
Because
stuff,
that's-
even if looking at this.
So we're gonna go ahead and get started. In case you're tracking along, we decided, and people who weren't, we decided that last week, I talked to everybody, so some of you don't know this, but I'll say it again. We're not gonna have a session next week. This is gonna be our final session. We're gonna finish up the Are You Ready toolkit, and we're gonna wish you Godspeed. And let you move on from there. I had some speakers cancel, which left some holes in the schedule, and so this is why we decided to do it this way.
And then somehow we had on our calendar something for Friday, 22nd? No. Okay, great.
Unless it came from somebody else within the CTR other than me. Nothing ACE.
Nothing ACE.
Nothing ACE.
Some kind of luncheon? No. Was there ever something
Originally,
like
there
that?
was going to be a luncheon next week. Yeah,
The
there was going to be a
21st.
luncheon next
Oh.
week, a reunion with
For
the
the
ACE
class.
awardees
We had it
from
on the
last
21st
year.
and the 22nd, so it's just must
So
be-
basically, the speakers fell
Yeah, yeah.
through, and so we would have had them coming at noon, and then we would have had one thing to do between 9 and noon, and that seemed to me not the best use of everybody's time. And while I could have, and I was having trouble getting a speaker to sub for the speakers that I was going to have, I could have kept scrambling around, but it seemed like I was trying to just jam that peg in the round hole, and that everyone would be appreciative of the time and understanding that you're not going to get a speaker on dissemination is what we're missing.
Got it.
So, certainly I would tell you this, if you feel in any way left out, our speakers on dissemination last year, and I'm blanking on who the other one was, but online, on the CTR website, is Dr. Richard Derman, who's the chair of obstetrics and gynecology here, and he gave a really great talk on dissemination, and he's done research on women and children's health, regionally and nationally, but interestingly, he's done a lot of international work, which I think really speaks to how do you take your idea and sort of propel it to really, be more than influential in the group that you started out in, which I think is the key to dissemination. And he has some good questions, sort of, here are some things to ask yourself as you do this work to sort of make sure you're keeping your eye on the prize. So certainly watch it. I don't want you to miss out on that, but I think that you can get your proposals, tucked in together, ready to go, and move forward without that piece. So there you go. So that's it. So we took sort of an informal pulse of the class, and everybody was okay with that. So for those of you that weren't here to weigh in, sorry. Anyway, so yeah, this is it. So basically, the Are You Ready toolkit, we left off to finish chapters 4, 5, and 6. So chapter 4, if you haven't already, I would just point out, and I'm not going to make you do it now, on pages 40 and 41 are some really good questions. So I would say answer them individually and then look at each other's books. Because it talks about a lot about the qualities that you feel are key to the project and who holds those qualities and how likely do you think that you are to be effective as a team in terms of leadership, and are there things that you need. So rather than
Please have page numbers again.
40 and 41.
Okay, thanks.
So, yep, I think, you should, the academic investigator and the community investigator or community investigators should each answer those and just take a look at what the other one had to say, because it'd be, you'd be surprised sometimes at the different perspectives. So, in response to that part of the chapter, I'm going to ask some of our community investigators to tell us a little bit what you believe is expected of you in terms of leadership on this project, and how has that changed, if it has at all, from when you entered, from the day you were contacted, hey, we're going to put this proposal together for this thing called the ACE Awards until now. So, who wants to start? Go ahead. You're looking like I want to start.
I'll start. We were brought into the project by Eva, and our mission was, since I was a former school principal and Terry is very connected to the disability community, to find clients to participate in the research study. So we initially, identified different schools, agencies of sorts. We then grew into having visitations there and talking to those folks with the idea of bringing in clients. Where it's gone from there has been, we've really established a much closer relationship in that even last week, this week, we just had a meeting with she and some potential interns and a grad student that's going to be supportive of the project, and also we're going to actually working with us as EPIC as a project during their winter room session. So we feel that we've grown in our knowledge of what her research project is, which is going to be working with the intellectual disabilities, but we're going to shape our EPIC initiative to do a lot of the same things that she's going to be doing there. So hopefully, when she finds success with her project, it might then come to ours, which is typically a group it's underrepresented in terms of research. So I've just found that we really have forged a nice partnership. I said to Heather before that this whole collaborative process we had here was very productive in terms of all of us, I think, having a real comfort level and asking questions and learning. But from our perspective with Eva and Al, it really has been a nice, symbiotic relationship between both.
So if I may, tell me if I'm mirroring this correctly. So what I hear, actually, I find very exciting, because you're saying, we came to this project essentially to help recruit, which is often a very sort of first, that's kind of like engaging the community 101, is finding someone to be your conduit to participants. Yes. But then I think what you're saying is you also really became, essential to integration. So that it wasn't going to be this, like, we have a research idea, you're the conduit, you enroll people, and it's done.
We became participants in the meetings with these. So we went to Easter Seals, we went to Meadowood School, we went to Chimes. So we were active participants within the whole dynamics of sharing the research with these agencies.
Right.
So yeah, it did grow into something more than just being...
So it sounds like integration and really dissemination.
Yes.
Right? Is that fair? So you kind of have thought about now, knowing what we know about this research and this program, how do we change how might we change what we're doing and is going on in the community to be more reflective, and then how do we expand it to other sites?
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yes.
Let me ask you this. Do you feel, has the circle begun to close? Do you feel that it's begun to happen now that the community is feeding back to the research? Because I also find that often, especially in classic academics, you begin, this little seedling is the research and the researcher. You know what I mean? And it's, when you talk about true CBPR, that's kind of that's the cultivated end product.
It's very interesting that the whole concept of community is something that's going to be, it's coming down the pipe. That, the whole idea of being more segregated is, even though you think it has changed over the years, there's still a lot of sheltered workshops, there's still a lot of day programs. And we're presenting a non-threatening alternative to that, but we're seeing that some of them are more accepting than others. And I think that upon the success of this initiative, I think more will come to the front. But I think that it's been just some basic steps to say, guys, the train's coming. Here's a way you can get on. And I think that's been very positive that way there. So yes, I see it coming, but not on the same. It's not everybody's embracing it completely, but we expected that.
Heather, just to build off of that and to maybe close that, the feedback that's come from the community for us has really been surprising, but maybe it's based on my naivete. When dealing with the statewide director of the Easter Seals or the statewide director of the YMCA, I was surprised that when we conveyed to them that research is a way of answering questions of clinical importance with confidence, they generated related questions that they've always wanted to have more confidence in the answers, or that they've never actually had anybody help them investigate. And so actually what we're going to help them do is answer some questions. We've shaped and modified our questions actually by adding some collateral questions that represent what they would like. And they've also grounded us in, what are the practical considerations that we must take into account to be able to conduct the research with them in their settings. So, it's really been very informative and has modified, not only our understanding, but a lot of what we're going to be doing.
It's been an interesting process. So we actually started about a year ago. It was our first meeting, and I just got an email out of the blue from Allison saying, we would like to just talk to see if there's something we could do with our healthy eating and other stuff initiatives in the zoo. And so we just kind of I went over to UD. I parked the car. I walked across the street, and we just started throwing ideas out. And I was like, well, this is nice. I'm sure I'll never hear from these people again. I have lots of meetings with people where they're very excited about something, and then we they came over and we had kind of a walkthrough, and everyone under the sun came, and then we started talking more in detail, and it was really good for me because I used to do experimental psychology research, and sort of be like, oh wait, I do remember some of these things. They're back there, even though I haven't touched them in a long time, and to sort of be able to provide them some well, how are we doing this, and why are we doing this? And I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Okay, with it. And then getting into this phase of it, we actually did a pilot study in the summertime. Which, once again, I was like, well, this is nice. We'll see if anything happens with this, and the response was really good, and all the data turned out to be worthwhile for us to pursue this further. Where I am right now is, currently I have fairly good buy-in from people on my side, and I'm hoping that stays, and at least at the top levels for people that report directly to me. But then it's, how do we get everybody on board with that? And it's going to be change, and I have a very change-resistant organization, and they've learned that since I've been there in a little over a year that I like to change things a lot. But it's been a really good partnership, and I don't know, I'm just rambling right now.
So it sounds like your role now, what I hear is facilitator.
In a lot of ways, yes.
That there's sort of, probably multiple aspects to your organization. You're saying they're change resistant. you've kind of had to be the, like, you know what I mean?
Oh
Like,
yeah, I'm the one who greases the wheels and gets everything done
Okay.
through, but other people ultimately have to act on it.
But it also sounds to me like you guys began, and I'm not surprised, because I think this is kind of Allison's training and work. You began from a very collaborative.
Yes.
The questions and the ideas and the program from the beginning were a little bit, you know.
Yeah, we went back and forth on a bunch of different
They
ideas.
were co-conceived.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts or comments or?
Oh, we love the zoo. And it's been, the fact that you were welcoming to, so Mike just said a whole bunch of us showed up, and they were students at multiple levels, and everyone was able to get involved, and we have students who are participating in collecting the data, analyzing the data, and writing up the data, and Mike's been supportive of that, which is really important to us. So I think at this point we can't really imagine a better partner. Allison does have a background in working with concession stands, so I think that fits nicely into a flow of research and content that's been coming out of our center.
Well, I would say, interestingly enough, there's been sort of a convergence of energies around what the partnership that Krishna and I have. We actually met last spring to talk about a partnership, a medical partnership between Nemours and ARC. And in our conversation, we were discussing LARCs and discussed both of our concerns about parental attitudes, because at Nemours, Krishna sees mostly parents who are bringing their kids to Nemours for care. At ARC, we don't have any parents bringing their kids, and we provide confidential service. So it just became a discussion and a concern that we both had, and that was really before thoughts about.
Before I knew about ACE or.
Yeah, before this project. So it was an inherent interest and concern, frankly, on both of our parts. And then this project came up, and we decided, wow, this would be really great. We talked about this, and now let's do some research and see if we can get this grant and do some research around this so we have some empirical data. And then simultaneously, the state of Delaware created this big initiative around LARCs, particularly for adolescents and young women. So, we were already on this train, and then this big effort started happening. So, we've gotten a lot of good feedback from other people in the community because of this project, because people are interested in getting parents and community members on board so that the LARCs can be more completely embraced and there will be less resistance. So it was kind of an organic evolution to this. Working in the community for so long, I have a lot of connections. Krishna sends me emails. She's like, do you know this person? I say, no. She goes, I thought you knew everybody. And it's just not that, it's just because I've been working in this field in Delaware for so long, I do have a lot of connections, but I don't know everybody. But I do have a lot of connections. So I think it's, my role is a very natural one, because I'm going to be able to find research assistants and help organize, the focus groups this class has been really helpful because it has sharpened the focus for us, both in terms of data, but in terms of how we're going to run the groups and what we're actually going to be looking for. And also, I've been reminded in a number of the classes about our own bias and what we're going into this, the perceptions that we have going into this. So I don't know if that specifically answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I think go ahead.
I would say I would add to kind of one of her roles that we kind of developed. I haven't ever really hired anybody like 2 docs, and it was like, oh, I like you like me, we think alike. Like I hired somebody like exactly my clone. So I've never really had to like go out and recruit and like figure out if this person is a good fit. But she does that as part of her job description. So when we're trying to get our community researchers who we're going to be compensating for working on our project, it was kind of natural to say, okay, Jane, the resumes will come to you, and you can do the pre-screening, because I'll be like, oh, Ashley, that sounds nice. She's a nice person. And so I think, that was another kind of role that I wouldn't have thought of, that just kind of naturally felt.
So how do you think the research trajectory, not even just necessarily, you can talk about this project, but, thinking about the impact, 2 or 3 steps down the line that your work will have, how do you think that is different because of your involvement, Jane? Like, what might have that looked like without you?
Well, one of the things, because we had a phone conversation yesterday with Dr.
Schlaff, yeah, the chairman at Jefferson of OB-GYN.
And, I think Christian and I talked after the conversation yesterday, and I think that we're clear that we have to stay in our lane. Okay, we've developed these research questions. We have an idea of what we want to find out. We're going to focus on parents. But later on down, what could we do with youth? How can we take it to the next step and do some research on young people's attitudes around this? So, I think there are potential next steps, and because of my work with adolescents, I think that would be a natural lead.
And I mean, I think without her, if we didn't have to have a community investigator involved, I probably would I run an adolescent clinic, I see parents every day, I'm going to survey the parents in my clinic. And that's kind of how that would have looked, and I would have written something and done a project about this is what the parents in my clinic think about LARC, and this is how we're going to increase access to the parents in my clinic. And that would have been great and interesting to some people, but I think now we're looking at the whole state and looking at a broader perspective, and I think that's how a lot of people like a lot of stuff that's out there is like these are the people that came to our clinic, and this is what we thought, and then we recruited from the clinic, and we're really trying to recruit people from the community, which may also involve people in our clinic, but it's a bigger focus. I think medicine, we're focused on kind of patients, and we're looking at people in the community.
I think clearly the partnership already takes a step away from silos. The other thing that might be interesting, and I don't know, this is just my my Lucy from Peanuts 2 cents psychiatry, but it's interesting. You both seem to have that sense of you're people that want to extrapolate and go big. You want to understand the bigger picture and move out, and not kind of more resistant to that ever present pull of research to say, okay, but let's keep it really specific. Let's pull it down to something concrete. Let's not do parents and kids. So I think both of you emotionally, sort of heart-wise, are pulled in this direction, not to the, reduce and sort of most simple, most clear-cut. And probably that'll be a strength, though, because in the end, research should be a tool to get in the direction that you both want to go. But it's about bringing it down to a doable step.
Yeah.
Without diluting.
So you'll keep each other honest. You'll keep each other. You know what I mean? Like if the partnership works out, sort of, steps and beyond, you will sort of invigorate each other's spirit towards why you took the first step. Make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, for me it was really Lindsay called and said, I'm doing this, are you interested in doing this, or could the VNA be represented in this in some fashion? And so I guess originally I looked at it as, yeah, we're going to get you a cohort of patients, you'll do all the work, and I'll eat bonbons. And then that didn't happen.
No bonbons in this class.
Yeah, that didn't happen. But I guess I will put out there though, a part of me has this, I guess it's Catholic guilt, because I feel like because it's something that the research itself is something that's so foreign to me from the perspective of this type of research. I was involved in clinical research related to clinical trials in oncology, never doing this type of research, which is very different. And so for me, I'm feeling really guilty because I feel this tremendous burden and load on Lindsay, but then I go back and I say, but she called me, I didn't call her. So then I feel better. So I made a resolution. But I think it's been really cool because when I came to Delaware 2 years ago, I came here because I was supported for an outpatient palliative care program, which to date still did not take place. So, we're already working on what we're going to be doing next from the perspective of I just started to work on a really preliminary business plan for a palliative care program through the VNA, which I just presented to my CEO and had conversation with Lindsay. So I'm looking at doing our research because we're looking specifically at specific homebound criteria and diagnosis in northern Delaware. That's exactly where we're then going to implement. So where, several weeks ago I said, well, what happens if a patient's interested in palliative care and we can't provide that? Hopefully by the time we implement and are working through our research, we should already have a skeleton crew that would be able to provide that in home care. So we're going to try to do the same area. So,
it's nice because we always had like an eye towards program development, but didn't know when that would come. But they don't necessarily need to run together. You can start piloting something in terms of programmatic and do the research, and I think they can both tie into each other, but also be independent. I have to say, I don't think you're eating bonbons.
Yeah, I feel like I am.
And it's it's one of those things that dividing and working together and coming up with deliverables. I feel like there is a lot of collaboration going on, and I feel like in a lot of what I've done in the past, maybe there isn't. I'm just like, I'm going to do this, but being able to really actually collaborate with somebody with a different skill set, with in a different area, with a different background, I think we've kind of learned a lot together.
And I think I've found really great value with the mentors. I mean, having Ina and having Jim Ellison has been quite interesting. I mean, he comes from this psych background that sometimes I do a lot of those pauses. When he says something, I seem to pause more often because I think, is he analyzing it or is he analyzing me? But it's been really great having the two of them to bounce our ideas and thoughts, and they've given really good feedback.
Michelle and Omar, are you on?
Unmute your phone so you can talk and hang up the phone.
Hello. Hello from the...
Says they're all on right now.
Hi, it's Michelle.
Hey, is Omar on?
I saw that he was before.
Somebody's phone.
Okay.
Well, I obviously joined the relationship with Omar late in the game since Jamel initiated it and was working with them, and she's still involved with everything, just more from the sideline, at least as of today, while she transitions to her new role. But I have to say that I am extremely impressed with the commitment and organization that Omar and his entire group has brought to the table. I've had one other experience doing a community engaged study, which was very basic level in another state. And they, that environment, they knew nothing about it. I was more trying to bring them along, where Omar's group, they are so much more committed and involved and engaged in the process and have multiple stakeholders they're already working with. They've already done research. They know this stuff and are really committed to moving things forward for the community. And actually, Omar has a partnership retreat that we're all getting together on Monday at their organization. And it's talking about who are the key players, what does everybody bring to the table, and what future directions can we all go and collaborate on. So I have been extremely impressed with all that they have in place already.
Great. And I'm just gonna, is Omar on? Are you there? Do you want to say anything? If he comes on, he can interrupt and let us know. So, Andrea, what you said is actually a good segue for me too. You know, I was thinking as you're talking, like, there's always exponentially more work than there is money. So then the question... Or time.
Or energy.
Or energy. All those things. Right. So it kind of makes me think about sustainability, right? So I'm just curious to hear the teams briefly. What are your thoughts about, you know, sustainability for your projects long term, or, you know, medium term, other than, you know, next step, I guess.
I think Andrea got into that some with our group, where because we were a little bit more generating and also working on development down the line, that there's a lot more work to do. But I think just building the basic capabilities for doing evaluations that can also be published and, you know, be more research driven and oriented, I think makes all of this more sustainable and makes it hopefully easier to carry forward, you know, the research part along with the program. I've seen a lot of successful programs, and, you know, why do I see them as successful? It's because they're publishing, they're reporting, and because of that, you know, we hear about them. And, you know, especially when you're doing innovative models of care in an area where there isn't much and there hasn't much that's done, there's a lot of opportunity for that, and I think it's given us a good stepping stone.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it's also the passion. I mean, I go back to, if somebody would have called me about any other project, I don't know that I would have wanted to invest my time, but I feel so strongly about palliative care and end of life that it was like a no-brainer to me.
And, you know, it's not, you know, it's a not uncommon theme, right? You know, a lot of people are on a team doing this kind of work, sometimes not so much because you're able to write them, you know, a big check for, you know, that really even represents their amount of time, you know, dedicated. It's about, you know, the good intention, you know, the hope, you know, the hope and passion you have around a certain issue, that, you know, you want to believe that at the end of the year, at the end of the day, at the end of your career, you know, that's a needle that moved because you were here. How about you guys? What do you think in terms of sustaining beyond this?
I mean, I think a natural way of sustaining is if we can ever ground and we'll be kind of working together clinically, then we can use the information from this project to kind of push it out to the clinics and then, you know, continue the project with that. And then I think the other thing that I realized as far as the time commitment, that if I really want to do this work, then I need to kind of do a career transition and try to get funding towards being a researcher as opposed to kind of doing it on the side, which is kind of also trying to get things in line that would support financially for that to happen.
And have you and I had some specific ideas too. Have you thought about the MRDAs? Is that something on your...
So I don't know how to do that. I would have to talk to somebody, but I definitely, you know, I know that was one of the things that attracted me about the ACE award is, like, you know, they made a line about this is the first step to kind of get towards the NIH grant, and that's where I want to go, particularly because I'd like to get a loan repayment grant. And so, like, and I'd like to see my child more. So, so I'm hoping.
Oh yeah, it'll be much better with research.
Well, I mean, yeah, it is in that in clinic, you're doing 2 hours of chart every night after doing a whole full day. Like with research, you're doing that, you know, it's a different kind of a thing. So I think that's kind of the transition.